If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Evelyn Frost, and I've lived my whole life in a small snowy town called Hollow Pines. It's the kind of place where winter seems to last forever, and the forests stretch out for miles, untouched and wild. People here don't talk much about what happens deep in those woods. They say it's cursed, but I never believed in that sort of thing until now. It all started on a cold January evening. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a sky painted in shades of orange and purple. I was sitting by the fireplace in my cabin sipping hot cocoa and listening to the wind howl outside. My dog, Jasper, was curled up at my feet, his ears twitching at every sound. It was peaceful, or at least it should have been. But something felt off. The wind didn't sound like it usually did. It wasn't just whistling through the trees. It was groaning, almost like a voice trying to speak. I shook my head, blaming my imagination. I'd heard stories growing up about strange things happening here, disappearances, shadows moving in the woods, but they were just tales meant to scare kids. Or so I thought. That night, as I was drifting off to sleep, there was a knock at my door. It startled me because no one ever visited this late, especially not in the middle of winter. Jasper barked furiously as I grabbed my coat and opened the door. Standing there was old Mr. Harris, one of the few people who lived even deeper in the woods than me. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "They're gone," he said, his voice trembling. "Gone? Who's gone?" I asked. "The fishermen," he replied. "They went out on the frozen lake 3 days ago and never came back." I frowned. Hollow Pines was known for its ice fishing during winter. People came from all over to try their luck on the lake. But disappearing? That wasn't normal. "They must have gotten lost," I said, trying to calm him down. "No," Mr. Harris whispered, shaking his head violently. "It's not that simple. There's something out there. Something evil." I stared at him, unsure of what to say. He looked so scared that it made me uneasy, too. "What do you mean?" I asked. He leaned closer and whispered a single word. "Wendigo." I froze. The Wendigo was part of an old legend around here, a creature said to haunt the forest during winter, feeding on anyone foolish enough to wander too far from safety. It sounded ridiculous, but Mr. Harris's fear was real. "I need your help," he said urgently. "You're smart, Evelyn. You know these woods better than anyone else." I hesitated for a moment before nodding. If people were missing, someone had to do something, even if it meant facing whatever was out there. As Mr. Harris left and I locked the door behind him, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. And much darker. Got it. Here's the next part of the story, keeping the tone calm, tense, and suspenseful while maintaining simple and natural language. The next morning, I packed a small bag with essentials: flashlight, extra batteries, a thermos of hot tea, and my old hunting knife. I wasn't planning to use it, but it felt better to have something sharp in my hand. Jasper was restless too, pacing around the cabin like he could sense something was wrong. The sun barely broke through the thick gray clouds as I stepped outside. The air was biting cold, and every breath came out in a puff of white mist. I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck and started walking toward the lake. It wasn't far, maybe a 20-minute hike through the woods, but every step felt heavier than usual. The forest was eerily quiet. Normally, you'd hear birds chirping or the crunch of squirrels darting through the snow. But today, nothing. Just the sound of my boots crunching on ice and Jasper's paws padding beside me. Even the wind had gone still, like the whole world was holding its breath. When I reached the lake, I stopped in my tracks. The fisherman's gear was still there, folding chairs, tackle boxes, even a half-eaten sandwich sitting on a rock. but there was no sign of them. No footprints leading away from the site, no broken ice where they might have fallen through. It was like they'd just vanished. I knelt down to examine the area more closely. That's when I noticed something strange. Claw marks in the snow. They were deep and uneven, like something big had dragged itself across the ground. My stomach tightened as I traced them with my eyes. They led from the edge of the lake into the woods. "Stay close, Jasper," I whispered as we followed the trail. The deeper we went into the forest, the darker it got. The trees were so tightly packed that they blocked out what little sunlight there was. The claw marks continued, carving a jagged path through the snow. And then I saw it. Something hanging from a low branch up ahead. At first, I thought it was just a piece of cloth caught on a tree. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't cloth at all. It was skin. Human skin. I stumbled back, my heart racing. Jasper growled low in his throat, his fur bristling as he stared into the shadows ahead. My mind raced with questions. What could have done this? Where were the fishermen? And why did it feel like we were being watched? I wanted to turn back. Every instinct told me to run home and lock my door. But something kept me moving forward. Maybe it was curiosity or stubbornness or just plain stupidity. Whatever it was, I couldn't stop now. The trail ended at a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. In the center stood an old wooden cabin I'd never seen before. Its roof sagged under the weight of snow, and its windows were covered in frost so thick you couldn't see inside. I approached cautiously, my hand gripping the knife in my pocket. Jasper stayed close to my side, his ears flat against his head. The door creaked open with a gentle push, revealing a dark interior that smelled of damp wood and something else. Something metallic and sour. Inside, there were signs of life. A small table with an oil lamp on it, a bed covered in tattered blankets, and shelves lined with jars filled with things I didn't want to think about too much. But what caught my attention most was what hung on the far wall, a map of hollow pines with red X's marking several spots around town. One of those X's was right over my cabin. My blood ran cold as I stared at it. Someone, or something, had been watching me. Before I could process what this meant, Jasper let out a sharp bark that echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. I turned just in time to see a shadow move outside one of the frosted windows, a shadow that wasn't mine or Jasper's. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the window. The shadow outside was tall, taller than any person I'd ever seen, and it moved slowly, almost like it was gliding through the snow. Jasper growled again, louder this time, his teeth bared and his fur standing on end. I didn't dare move. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever, or whatever, was out there would hear it. Slowly, I backed away from the window, gripping my knife tightly in my hand. Jasper stayed by my side, his eyes locked on the frosted glass. The shadow disappeared. I let out a shaky breath, but I didn't feel any safer. If anything, the silence made it worse. It felt like the air had gotten heavier, pressing down on me from all sides. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin. It wasn't safe, but stepping outside felt just as dangerous. Gathering my courage, I grabbed the map from the wall and stuffed it into my bag. If those red X's meant something, I needed to figure it out, and fast. As I turned to leave, Jasper barked again, this time lunging toward the door. I yanked it open and stepped outside into the clearing. The shadow was gone, but the claw marks were back, deep grooves in the snow leading away from the cabin and into the woods. They were fresh. "Come on, Jasper," I whispered, my voice shaking as I followed the trail. The forest seemed darker than before, even though it was still daytime. The trees loomed over me like silent giants, their branches twisting into shapes that looked almost human. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the snow was pulling me down. And then it started. The whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees. But as I kept walking, I realized it wasn't random noise. It was voices, soft and distant, like they were coming from far away but getting closer with every step. Evelyn. I stopped dead in my tracks. My name echoed through the forest like someone had spoken it right next to me. Jasper whimpered and pressed against my leg, his tail tucked between his legs. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound brave, even though my voice cracked. No answer, just more whispers. They were coming from all directions now, circling me like invisible predators. My chest tightened as panic started to set in. I wanted to run, but where? Back to the cabin? Home? Or deeper into the woods? The claw marks led forward, and despite every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I kept following them. The trail ended at another clearing, a larger one this time, with a frozen pond in the middle. The ice was smooth and untouched except for one thing, a single hole near the center where someone, or something, had broken through. I stepped closer cautiously, my boots crunching on the snow. The whispers grew louder as I approached the edge of the pond. "Evelyn," they said again, this time clearer. I looked down into the hole and gasped. There was something under the ice, a face staring up at me with wide, lifeless eyes. It was one of the fishermen. Before I could react, a sudden wave of dizziness hit me like a punch to the gut. The world spun around me as my vision blurred and darkened at the edges. The whispers grew louder and louder until they were deafening, and then everything went quiet. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't standing by the pond anymore, I was back in my cabin. But something was wrong. The fireplace had gone cold, and Jasper was nowhere to be seen. I looked down at my hands and screamed. They weren't mine anymore. They were pale and clawed, with skin stretched tight over bones that felt too sharp to be human. I stared at my hands, trembling. My fingers were long and twisted, the nails sharp like claws. I felt sick to my stomach. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare. I slapped my face, hoping to wake up, but nothing changed. The cabin was still cold and silent, and my hands, they were still wrong. "Jasper?" I called out weakly, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I stumbled to the door, desperate to find him, or anyone who could help me. When I stepped outside, the world looked different. The snow was darker, almost gray, and the trees seemed taller than before, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The whispers came back. "Evelyn." They sounded closer now, like they were coming from inside my head. I clutched my temples and squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block them out. But they didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder. "Come, come." I didn't know where I was going or why I was listening to those voices, but my feet started moving on their own. It was like something was pulling me forward, guiding me deeper into the woods. After what felt like hours of walking, I reached a steep hill covered in ice. At the bottom was an opening, a cave hidden beneath layers of frozen snow. The whispers were deafening now, urging me to go inside. I hesitated at first. Every instinct told me this place wasn't safe. But something about it felt familiar, like I'd been here before, or like it had been waiting for me all along. The moment I stepped inside the cave, the temperature dropped even lower. My breath came out in thick clouds as I moved deeper into the darkness. The walls glistened with ice crystals that sparkled in the faint light filtering through cracks above. And then I saw them, the fishermen. They were lying on the ground in a circle around a frozen lake at the center of the cave. Their faces were pale and lifeless, their eyes wide with terror. But what scared me most wasn't their bodies. It was what stood in the middle of them. It was tall, at least 7 feet, and impossibly thin, with skin stretched tight over its bones like parchment. Its arms were long and clawed, its face sunken and hollow with glowing yellow eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. The Wendigo. I couldn't move, I couldn't even breathe as it turned its head toward me and let out a low growl that echoed through the cave like thunder. My legs felt like jelly as I stumbled backward, desperate to get away. But then something strange happened. The Wendigo didn't attack me. Instead, it tilted its head as if studying me. Its glowing eyes narrowed slightly before it let out another growl, this one softer than before. And that's when I realized something horrifying. It wasn't looking at me like prey. It was looking at me like one of its own. I stood frozen in place, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. The Wendigo's glowing yellow eyes bore into mine, unblinking. It didn't make a move toward me, but its presence was enough to send waves of fear coursing through my body. My twisted hands trembled as I clutched the knife in my pocket, though I knew it wouldn't do much against something like this. "Stay calm," I whispered to myself, though my voice was shaking. "Just stay calm." The creature let out a low, guttural sound that echoed through the icy cave. It wasn't a growl exactly, it was more like words. But they weren't words I could understand. They were ancient, guttural sounds that made my head ache just hearing them. And then, as if in response to its strange language, the whispers in my head grew louder. "Evelyn. Join us." I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block them out. "No, leave me alone," I shouted, my voice bouncing off the icy walls of the cave. The Wendigo tilted its head again, almost curiously. It took a slow step toward me, its long claws scraping against the frozen ground. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like I was rooted to the spot. "Why aren't you attacking me?" I blurted out before I could stop myself. The creature paused. For a moment I thought it might actually answer me, but instead it raised one of its bony arms and pointed toward the frozen lake at the center of the cave. I followed its gaze and saw something beneath the ice, something glowing faintly in the darkness below. It looked like a heart, a massive, pulsating heart encased in ice. "What is that?" I whispered. The whispers in my head grew even louder now, almost deafening. "It's you," they said. "It's always been you?" I stumbled back, shaking my head. "No, that's not true. I'm not one of you." But even as I said it, I felt something deep inside me, a connection to this place, to this creature. My body felt heavy and cold, like the ice around me was seeping into my very bones. The Wendigo growled again and pointed toward the heart once more. This time, I understood what it wanted me to do. "No," I said firmly, gripping the knife tighter in my hand. "I don't know what you think I am, but I'm not going to help you." The creature let out an ear-piercing screech that made me drop to my knees, clutching my ears in pain. Jasper's face flashed in my mind, his warm brown eyes looking up at me with trust and love, and that gave me strength. I forced myself back to my feet and took a shaky step toward the frozen lake. The Wendigo didn't try to stop me. It just watched silently as I approached the glowing heart beneath the ice. I raised the knife above my head and brought it down with all my strength. The ice cracked beneath me with a deafening roar, splitting apart like glass shattering in slow motion. The glow from the heart grew brighter and brighter until it filled the entire cave with blinding light. And then everything went still. When I opened my eyes again, the Wendigo was gone. The fishermen's bodies were gone too, vanished without a trace. The cave was empty except for me and Jasper, who stood by my side wagging his tail like nothing had happened. But something had changed. I could feel it deep inside me. The whispers were gone from my head, but so was something else. Fear. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt free. I stood there, staring at the cracked ice beneath my feet. The glow from the heart had faded, leaving behind only darkness. My breath came out in shaky puffs as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Was it over? Had I defeated the Wendigo? Or was this just the beginning of something worse? Jasper nudged my leg. his warm nose bringing me back to reality. "It's okay, boy," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. "We're going home." But as I turned to leave the cave, a sharp pain shot through my chest. It was so sudden and intense that I fell to my knees, clutching at my heart. Jasper barked frantically, circling me as I gasped for air. The whispers were back. "Evelyn, you are chosen." "No," I screamed, my voice echoing through the empty cave. "Leave me alone." But the pain only grew worse. It felt like something was clawing its way out of me, tearing apart everything I thought I knew about myself. My hands, those twisted, clawed hands, began to glow faintly, just like the heart beneath the ice had. And then I saw it. My reflection in the cracked ice. It wasn't me anymore. My face was pale and hollow, my eyes glowing faintly yellow like the Wendigo's. My teeth were sharper, my skin stretched tight over bones that didn't feel like they belonged to me. "No," I whispered, shaking my head as tears streamed down my face. "This can't be happening." The whispers grew louder, filling my head with words I couldn't understand but somehow felt deep in my soul. They weren't just voices. They were memories. Memories of people who had come before me, people who had been chosen by this place just like I was now. I realized then what the Wendigo had been trying to tell me. It wasn't a monster, it was a guardian, a protector of this land, cursed to live in isolation and feed on those who dared to disturb its peace. And now, it was my turn. "No," I said again, louder this time. "I won't do it. I won't become like you." But deep down, I knew it wasn't up to me anymore. The transformation was already happening. As the pain subsided and the whispers faded into silence, I felt a strange calm wash over me. My body no longer felt foreign. It felt powerful. The cold that had once bitten at my skin now felt comforting, like an old friend wrapping me in its embrace. Jasper barked again, his tail wagging nervously as he looked up at me with wide eyes. He didn't seem scared, just confused. "It's okay," I told him softly, kneeling down to stroke his fur with hands that no longer looked human. "I'm still me, I think." But even as I said it, I knew things would never be the same again. I walked out of the cave, Jasper trotting beside me. The forest felt different now. It wasn't just the eerie silence or the way the snow seemed darker. It was me. I could feel it in every step I took, in the way the wind wrapped around. Me like it was part of me now. The whispers were gone, but something else had replaced them. A deep connection to the woods, to the snow-covered ground beneath my feet, and to the icy air that filled my lungs. I wasn't Evelyn Frost anymore. Not completely. I was something more. As I made my way back to my cabin, I noticed things I hadn't before. The faint sound of water flowing beneath the frozen lake, the way the trees seemed to sway even without wind, and the distant cries of animals warning each other of my presence. It was like the forest had come alive for me, revealing secrets it had kept hidden from everyone else. When I reached my cabin, it looked just as I'd left it, small and cozy with smoke still curling from the chimney. But as I stepped inside, I realized that this place no longer felt like home. It was too warm, too small, too human. Jasper jumped onto his favorite spot by the fireplace and wagged his tail. He didn't seem to notice how much had changed. Or maybe he did, but didn't. Kare. To him, I was still Evelyn. I sat down at the table and pulled out the map I'd taken from the cabin in the woods. The red X's stared back at me like warnings, or invitations. One of them marked my cabin, but there were others scattered across. Hollow pines. What did they mean? Were there others like me out there? Or were they places where people had disappeared? I didn't know, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. The Wendigo hadn't been destroyed. It had been passed on to me. I thought about what that meant as I stared out the window at the snow-covered trees. Would I become a monster like it had been? Would I lose myself completely? Or could I find a way to break this curse? The whispers were gone for now, but I knew they would come back eventually. And when they did, I'd have to make a choice. Fight them or give in. For now, though, all I could do was wait. As night fell over Hollow Pines, I stood by the window watching the snow fall softly outside. The forest looked peaceful, almost beautiful. But I knew better now. There were things out there that no one understood, things that couldn't be explained or stopped. And now, I was one of them. My name is Malcolm Everett. I'm a wildlife researcher, or at least I was until everything changed. The story isn't one I tell often, mostly because people don't believe me. But it happened, and it's something I'll never forget. It all started 2 years ago when I was sent to the Hoh Rainforest in Washington state to investigate some strange reports. People said the wildlife was acting weird, disappearing without explanation. Some even claimed to hear voices deep in the woods, voices that didn't belong to any human. The Hoh Rainforest is one of the most beautiful places on Earth. It's always damp, with moss hanging from every tree like nature's curtains. The air smells fresh but heavy, almost like it's alive. But that week, something felt off. The forest was quieter than usual. No birds chirping, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just silence, like the whole place was holding its breath. I arrived at the research station late in the afternoon. It was a small wooden cabin surrounded by towering trees and endless greenery. My team had been stationed there for weeks before me, but when I stepped inside, the place was empty. Their gear was still there, backpacks, notebooks, even a half-eaten sandwich left on the table, but there were no signs of them anywhere. At first, I thought they'd gone out for field work and lost track of time, but as night fell and they still hadn't returned, I started to worry. I tried calling their radios, but all I got was static. The forest outside seemed darker than it should have been, even with the moon overhead. Shadows stretched farther then. I didn't sleep much that first night. Something about the silence outside felt wrong, like the forest itself was watching me. I kept the cabin door locked and stayed close to the radio, hoping my team would call in. But the static never changed. By morning, I decided I couldn't just sit around. I had to find them. I packed a small bag with essentials: water, a flashlight, and a map of the area. The forest was dense, but I'd been trained for this kind of thing. I told myself they were probably just lost or had some kind of equipment. Failure. That's what made sense, right? People don't just vanish. As I stepped into the woods, the air felt heavier than usual, like it was pressing down on me. The trees seemed taller, their branches twisting in ways I hadn't noticed before. Every step I took felt louder than it should have, like the forest was amplifying the sound of my boots crunching on the damp ground. About an hour into my search, I found something strange, a trail of footprints leading away from the cabin. They weren't from boots or hiking shoes, they were bare feet. At first, I thought maybe one of my team members had lost their shoes and wandered off. But as I followed the trail deeper into the woods, something didn't add up. The footprints were too large to belong to any of them, and they weren't shaped. Quite right. The toes were longer, almost claw-like. I stopped and looked around, suddenly feeling exposed. The trees were so thick here that barely any sunlight reached the ground. It was cold, colder than it should have been for that time of year. I thought about turning back, but something kept me moving forward. Maybe it was curiosity or just plain stubbornness. I don't know. A little farther down the trail, I found something else. A torn piece of fabric caught on a branch. It looked like part of a jacket, one of ours. My heart raced as I grabbed it and stuffed it into my bag. At least it meant they'd been here recently. But then I noticed something else that made my stomach drop. The footprints didn't just lead forward. They circled back around in strange patterns, almost like whoever, or whatever, made them had been pacing or watching something. The forest felt even quieter now, if that was possible. No birds, no insects, nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the occasional creak of branches overhead. Then I heard it, a faint sound in the distance. It wasn't an animal or wind through the trees, it was a voice. Help. It was soft and weak, like someone calling out but too tired to yell. My heart pounded as I turned toward the sound and called back, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. I stood there for what felt like forever, straining to hear anything else. But there was only silence again. My instincts told me to go back to the cabin and wait for help, but something about that voice, it sounded familiar. I decided to keep going. I followed the sound of the voice, moving carefully through the thick underbrush. The forest seemed to grow darker with every step, even though it was still daytime. My flashlight barely cut through the shadows, and the trees felt like they were closing in around me. I kept my ears open, hoping to hear the voice again, but all I could hear was my own breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. After about 20 minutes of walking, I stumbled upon something that made me freeze in place. It was a backpack, one of ours. It was lying on the ground, half buried in leaves and dirt. I crouched down and unzipped it, hoping to find some clue about what had happened. Inside were some notebooks, a water bottle, and a flashlight with dead batteries. But what caught my attention most was a journal. The journal belonged to Sarah, one of my teammates. She always kept detailed notes about everything: weather patterns, animal sightings, even her thoughts about the day. I flipped through the pages quickly, looking for anything unusual. Most of it seemed normal at first, descriptions of the forest, notes about wildlife, but then I reached the last few entries. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. Sarah wrote about hearing strange noises at night, whispers coming from deep in the woods. She mentioned seeing shadows that didn't match anything around her and feeling like she was being watched. Her last entry was short. "Something is out here with us. It's not human." I felt a chill run down my spine as I closed the journal and stuffed it back into the backpack. Whatever had scared Sarah, and possibly the rest of my team, was still out here. I kept moving forward, following what looked like a trail of disturbed leaves and broken branches. It wasn't much to go on, but it was better than nothing. As I walked, I started noticing other strange things. Scratches on tree trunks that looked too deep to be made by any animal I knew, piles of rocks stacked in odd formations, and more, footprints that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Then I found something that stopped me cold. A campsite. It wasn't ours. It looked older, abandoned for weeks or maybe months. There were rusted cooking pots scattered around, a torn tent flapping weakly in the breeze, and scraps of paper littering the ground. I picked up one of the papers and saw it was covered in scribbled writing. Most of it didn't make sense, just random words and symbols, but one sentence stood out. "Don't follow the voices." I dropped the paper and stepped back from the campsite, my heart pounding in my chest. Whoever had been here before clearly hadn't left willingly. As I turned to leave, I heard something behind me, a faint rustling sound coming from inside the torn tent. My hands shook as I reached for my flashlight and pointed it toward the opening. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. I took a step closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The rustling grew louder, like something, or someone, was moving inside. "Is anyone there?" I asked again. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew through the trees, making the tent flap wildly and nearly knocking me off balance. When it settled again, there was nothing inside, just an empty sleeping bag covered in dirt. I backed away quickly, feeling like I just walked into someone else's nightmare. I left the abandoned campsite as quickly as I could. My instincts were screaming at me to go back to the cabin and call for help, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my team was still out there, somewhere. I kept following the trail, if you could even call it that, of broken branches and disturbed leaves. The deeper I went into the forest, the stranger everything became. The air felt colder now, almost icy, and the silence was deafening. It wasn't just quiet. It was like the forest had stopped breathing. No birds, no wind, not even the sound of my own footsteps seemed right. It was as if the world had been muted. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another shadow among the trees. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was something else. It stood about 7 feet tall, its body covered in dark, matted fur. Its arms were long, almost unnaturally so, and its hands ended in sharp claws that glinted in the faint light filtering through the canopy. But it wasn't its body that terrified me the most. It was its eyes. They were glowing faintly, like embers in a dying fire, and they seemed to pierce right through me. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. It didn't make a sound as it stared at me, but somehow I could feel it in my head. It was like a voice, not one I could hear with my ears, but one that echoed inside my mind. It wasn't speaking words exactly, but I could feel its intent. Curiosity mixed with something darker. Hunger. I don't know how long I stood there frozen in place. Seconds, minutes. Time didn't seem to work right anymore. Then, without warning, it moved. It didn't run or lunge. It just seemed to glide between the trees, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. My legs finally started working again, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a root. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and it wasn't an animal either. I wanted to turn around and run back to the cabin, but something stopped me. In the dirt where the creature had been standing, there was something shiny, a small metal object reflecting the light of my flashlight. I hesitated before stepping closer to look at it. When I picked it up, my stomach sank. It was Sarah's compass, the one she always carried with her on fieldwork trips. The strap was broken and stained with something dark that looked too much like blood. That's when I realized something terrifying. This thing wasn't just wandering through the forest randomly. It had been following them, my team, and now it was following me. I shoved the compass into my pocket and forced myself to keep moving forward. Every instinct told me to run back to safety, but I couldn't leave without knowing what had happened to Sarah and the others. As I walked deeper into the woods, I started noticing more signs: scraps of clothing snagged on branches, broken equipment scattered on the ground, and always those strange footprints circling around them like some kind of sick game. The feeling of being watched never went away. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between trees or a flash of those glowing eyes, but whenever I turned to look directly at it, there was nothing there. I didn't know what this thing wanted or why it hadn't attacked me yet. All I knew was that it wasn't going to let me leave easily. I kept walking, even though every part of me wanted to turn back. The forest seemed endless, and the deeper I went, the stranger it became. The trees were twisted now, their branches reaching out like claws. The ground felt softer, almost like it was breathing beneath my feet. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led somewhere, not by a trail, but by something unseen, indeed, what felt like hours. I came across something unexpected, a clearing. It was small and surrounded by trees so thick they blocked out most of the light. In the center of the clearing was a hole in the ground, a mine shaft. The opening was surrounded by old wooden beams that looked like they'd been there for decades, maybe longer. Rusted tools and broken lanterns were scattered around, half buried in dirt and moss. I didn't know why, but I felt drawn to it. Maybe it was hope that my team had taken shelter inside, or maybe it was something else entirely. Either way, I couldn't walk away. I stepped closer and peered into the mine shaft. It was dark, so dark that even my flashlight couldn't reach the bottom. The air coming from inside smelled damp and metallic, like wet stone mixed with something rotten. I hesitated before climbing down the old wooden ladder that led into the depths. The ladder creaked under my weight, and every step felt like it might be my last. When I finally reached the bottom, I found myself in a narrow tunnel that stretched out in both directions. The walls were rough stone, covered in patches of moss and strange markings, symbols carved into the rock that didn't look natural. I turned to the left and started walking, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Ahead of me, the tunnel twisted and turned, growing colder with every step. My breath came out in white puffs now, and my hands were shaking, not just from fear, but from the chill that seemed to seep into my bones. Then I saw it, a pile of belongings scattered. And across the tunnel floor, backpacks, notebooks, jackets, all things that belonged to my team. My heart sank as I knelt down to examine them. There were scratches on some of the items, deep gouges that looked like they'd been made by claws. Nearby, there was something else, a notebook lying open on the ground. It wasn't Sarah's. It belonged to Mark, another member of my team. His handwriting was messy but readable. "We're trapped down here. It's watching us. We tried to leave, but it won't let us go." The last line sent chills down my spine. It's not just a creature. It's something older, something we shouldn't have disturbed. I stood up quickly, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I scanned the tunnel ahead. That's when I heard it. A low growl coming from somewhere deep in the mine. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard. It was guttural and bone-chilling, vibrating through the walls like thunder trapped underground. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The growling grew louder, closer, until I could feel it in my chest like a drumbeat. Then I saw them, two glowing eyes staring at me from the darkness ahead. It wasn't alone. I froze as the glowing eyes stared back at me, unblinking and filled with something I couldn't describe, something ancient and predatory. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment the tunnel was plunged into darkness. When the light came back on, the creature was closer. I could see its outline now, tall, hunched, and covered in fur that looked damp and matted. Its claws scraped against the stone walls as it moved forward, but it didn't make a sound otherwise. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were cemented to the ground. My breathing was shallow, and my heart felt like it might burst out of my chest. Then it happened. The thing spoke to me, not with words, not out loud, but inside my head. At first, it was just a whisper, soft and faint, like someone murmuring in another room. But then it grew louder, clearer. It wasn't speaking in sentences or even words I could understand. It was showing me things. Images flashed through my mind so quickly I couldn't process them. Shadows moving through the forest, faces twisted in fear, hands clawing at the dirt. Then came the memories. It was like the creature had reached inside me and pulled out every painful moment I'd ever buried deep down. I saw my father's funeral, the day I lost him to a heart attack when I was just a kid. I saw the fight I had with Sarah before this trip, the harsh words we exchanged that I never got to take back. And worst of all, I saw myself standing alone in the cabin, realizing that if I didn't find my team soon, they might be gone forever. The images overwhelmed me, crashing over me like waves until I couldn't tell what was real anymore. My knees buckled, and I fell to the ground, clutching my head as if that could stop it. The growling grew louder in my ears, but it wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was inside me. I don't know how long it lasted. Seconds? Minutes? It felt like an eternity. But then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The tunnel was silent again except for my ragged breathing. When I looked up, the creature was gone. Or at least I thought it was. I scrambled to my feet and backed, away from where it had been standing. My flashlight flickered again, but this time it stayed on long enough for me to see something carved into the wall where the creature had been. A symbol. a circle with jagged lines radiating outward like a sunburst. It wasn't random. It meant something. I didn't know what compelled me to do it, but I reached out and touched the symbol with my fingertips. The stone felt warm under my hand, almost alive. That's when another image flashed through my mind. This one, clearer than all the others. It showed a grove of trees somewhere deep in the forest, a place untouched by time or human hands. In the center of the grove stood an ancient altar made of stone, covered in moss and surrounded by glowing symbols like the one on the wall. I didn't understand what it meant yet, but one thing was clear. If I wanted to survive, and if I wanted to save my team, I had to find that grove. I climbed out of the mine as fast as I could, my hands shaking on the ladder rungs. The air outside felt colder now, and the forest seemed even darker than before. The image of the grove was burned into my mind. It was like the creature had planted it there, showing me where I needed to go. But why? Was it leading me into a trap? Or was this my only chance to save my team? I didn't have time to think about it. I adjusted my flashlight and started walking in the direction I thought the grove might be. The forest was silent again, but this time, the silence felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me with every step. My boots sank into the damp ground, and the trees seemed to shift around me, their twisted branches forming shapes that looked almost human. After what felt like hours, I saw something ahead, a faint glow filtering through the trees. My heart raced as I pushed through the underbrush, branches snagging at my clothes and scratching my arms. When I stepped into the clearing, I stopped dead in my tracks. It was exactly like the image in my mind. The grove was small but otherworldly. The trees formed a perfect circle around a stone altar in the center, their trunks covered in glowing symbols that pulsed faintly like they were alive. The altar itself was ancient, cracked and weathered but still standing strong. Moss and vines clung to its surface, and at its base were more symbols carved into the stone. I stepped closer, my flashlight illuminating the altar. It felt wrong to be here, like I was trespassing on something sacred. But I couldn't turn back. Now, not after everything I'd seen. As I examined the altar, I noticed something strange. There were markings on the ground around it. Footprints. They weren't human, and they weren't like the ones I'd seen earlier either. These were larger, deeper, and spaced farther apart, as if whatever made them had been pacing around the grove. I knelt down to touch one of the footprints, and as soon as my fingers brushed against it, another image flashed through my mind. This, one more vivid than anything before. It showed a group of people standing around the altar, tribal figures dressed in animal skins and holding torches that flickered in the darkness. They were chanting something I couldn't understand, their voices blending together in a haunting melody. In front of them stood a creature, the same one I'd seen in the tunnel, but it looked different somehow. It wasn't attacking them. It was bound by glowing chains that seemed to hold it in place. The vision ended abruptly, leaving me gasping for air. My head throbbed as I tried to make sense of what I'd just seen. This grove wasn't just a random place, it was connected to the creature somehow. The altar wasn't just stone, it was part of something bigger, something ancient. I stood up and backed away from the altar, feeling a chill run down my spine. Whatever had happened here long ago wasn't over yet, and now I was part of it. That's when I heard it again. The growling. It wasn't far this time. It was close. Too close. I turned around slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I scanned the edge of the grove. The shadows seemed to move on their own now, shifting and twisting like they were alive. Then I saw them, those glowing eyes staring at me from between the trees. The glowing eyes didn't move. They just stared at me, unblinking from the edge of the grove. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, but what could I do? This wasn't something I could fight. Not with my hands. Not with anything I had. I stepped back toward the altar, keeping my eyes on the creature. It didn't growl this time. It was silent, watching me like it was waiting for something. My mind raced as I tried to piece everything together. The visions, the symbols, the tribal figures binding the creature. The altar wasn't just a relic. It was a weapon, a way to stop whatever this thing was. But how? I looked down at the carvings on the altar, tracing them with my fingers. They glowed faintly under my touch, pulsing like a heartbeat. The symbols seemed to shift and change as I looked at them, forming patterns that felt familiar even though I'd never seen them before. Then I remembered Sarah's journal. The frantic notes about whispers in the woods and shadows that didn't belong. She'd written about something ancient, something that shouldn't have been disturbed. This grove wasn't just a place, it was a prison, and somehow the creature had escaped. I didn't know what I was doing, but I had to try something. If this altar had been used to bind the creature before, maybe it could do it again. I placed both hands on the stone and closed my eyes, focusing on the symbols and the vision of the chanting figures. The air around me seemed to shift, growing, heavier and colder. The growling started again, low and guttural, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. The symbols began to glow brighter now, their light spreading across the altar and into the surrounding trees. The creature stepped closer, its claws scraping against the dirt as it moved into the grove. Its eyes burned brighter than ever, filled with rage and hunger. I opened my mouth to speak, not words I knew, but words that seemed to come from somewhere, deep inside me. They weren't English or any language I recognized. They were ancient, primal, like they belonged to the forest itself. The creature roared, its voice echoing through the grove like thunder. It lunged toward me, but as it crossed into the circle of trees, it stopped abruptly as if it had hit an invisible wall. The glowing symbols spread outward now, forming a barrier around me and the altar. The roar turned into a scream, a horrible sound that made my ears ring and my head throb. The creature clawed at the barrier, its movements frantic and desperate. But no matter how hard it tried, it couldn't break through. The chanting in my head grew louder now, drowning out everything else, the growling, the screaming, even my own thoughts. The symbols on the altar pulsed faster and faster until they exploded in a flash of light that lit up the entire grove. When the light faded, everything was silent. The creature was gone. For a moment I thought it was over. The creature was gone, and the grove was quiet again. But then I felt it. The ground beneath my feet trembled, almost like a heartbeat. The glowing symbols on the altar began to fade, their light dimming until they were barely visible. Whatever I had done wasn't enough. The creature wasn't gone, it was still here, trapped but fighting to break free. I stumbled back from the altar, my legs shaking. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what had gone wrong. The vision of the tribal figures flashed through my head again. The chanting, the glowing chains, the way they had stood together around the altar. They hadn't just used the symbols to bind the creature. They had given something of themselves. A sacrifice. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The altar wasn't just a tool. It demanded something in return. That's why the creature had escaped in the first place. Its bindings had weakened because no one had been here to maintain them. I looked around the grove, my flashlight casting long shadows across the twisted trees. I thought about my team, Sarah, Mark, and the others, and how they might still be out there somewhere waiting for me to save them. If I didn't do this now, if I didn't stop this thing for good, it would keep hunting them. And anyone else who came into these woods. I took a deep breath and stepped back toward the altar. My hands trembled as I placed them on the cold stone again. The symbols flared to life under my touch, brighter than before, almost blinding. The air around me grew heavy, pressing down on my chest like a weight. "I'm not afraid of you," I whispered, though my voice shook with every word. The growling returned, louder this time, echoing all around me. The creature's eyes appeared again at the edge of the grove, glowing like fire in the darkness. It paced back and forth just outside the circle of trees, unable to enter but watching me with a hunger that made my skin crawl. I closed my eyes and focused on the symbols, letting their energy flow through me. My thoughts turned to Sarah. Her laugh, her determination, the way she always pushed me to be better. If this was what it took to save her and everyone else, then so be it. The chanting started again, not in my voice but in my mind. It was louder now, filling every corner of my thoughts until there was no room for fear or doubt. The light from the altar grew brighter and brighter until it felt like I was standing in the middle of a star. Then I felt it, a sharp pain in my chest that made me gasp for air. It wasn't physical, it was deeper than that, like something inside me was being pulled away. My vision blurred as I fell to my knees, but I didn't let go of the altar. The creature roared again, its voice filled with rage and desperation. It lunged at the barrier around the grove, clawing at it with everything it had. But this time, it couldn't break through. The light from the altar exploded outward one final time, washing over everything. The trees, the ground, even the creature itself. When it faded, there was nothing left but silence. I collapsed onto the ground, too, weak to move or even open my eyes. My chest felt hollow, like a piece of me had been taken away forever. But I knew it was done. The creature was gone, bound once again by whatever ancient force had created this place. As I lay there in the dirt, staring up at the faint glow of the symbols on the trees above me, I felt a strange sense of peace. I didn't know if I'd make it out of this forest alive, or if anyone would ever find me here, but at least I'd done what needed to be done. When I woke up, the grove was quiet. The air felt lighter, almost normal, and the glowing symbols on the trees had faded completely. The altar was cold and lifeless now, just a cracked stone covered in moss. Whatever power it had before was gone, and so was the creature. I sat up slowly, my body aching all over. My head felt foggy, like I'd been asleep for days. I looked around, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching me from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the stillness of the forest. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel like I was being watched. I didn't know how long I'd been unconscious or how far I was from the cabin, but I knew I had to move. My team might still be out there, waiting for me. Or, worse, they might need help. I forced myself to stand, leaning on a tree for support as my legs wobbled beneath me. The walk back through the forest felt different this time. The trees didn't seem as twisted, and the air wasn't as heavy. It was still quiet, too quiet, but it didn't feel hostile anymore. It felt empty. After what felt like hours, I finally saw the cabin through the trees. My heart leapt at the sight of it, but when I stepped inside, my stomach sank. It was just as I'd left it, empty. No sign of Sarah or Mark or anyone else. I searched every corner of the cabin, calling their names over and over again, but there was no answer. Their gear was still there, their backpacks, their notebooks, but they were gone. I slumped into a chair at the table, staring at the half-eaten sandwich someone had left behind. My mind raced with questions. Where had they gone? Had they escaped? Or had the creature gotten to them before I could stop it? Then I noticed something on the table, a small notebook with a folded piece of paper tucked inside. It wasn't mine, but it looked familiar. My hands shook as I opened it and saw Sarah's handwriting. If you're reading this, it means we didn't make it back. My breath caught in my throat as I read her words. We tried to fight it, but we couldn't. Stop it. If you found the grove and did what needed to be done, thank you. You saved more lives than you'll ever know. The note ended there, but her words stayed with me long after I closed the notebook. They were gone, Sarah, Mark, all of them, but they hadn't died in vain. Whatever that creature was, it wouldn't hurt anyone else now. I stayed in the cabin, that night too exhausted to move. The forest outside was still eerily quiet, but for once it didn't feel threatening. It felt at peace. When morning came, I packed up what little gear I could carry and started walking back toward civilization. The hike out of the forest was long and grueling, but eventually I made it to a ranger station where they called for help. I told them everything, the missing team members, the strange footprints, even the creature, but they didn't believe me. They said my team must have gotten lost or fallen victim to an animal attack. They chalked up my story to stress and exhaustion, but I know what I saw. Even now, years later, I can still feel that creature's presence sometimes, like a shadow, lingering just out of sight, and sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, I hear whispers in my dreams, faint voices calling from deep within the woods. I don't go back to forests anymore, not after what happened in Ho Rainforest, but sometimes I wonder if that grove is still out there, waiting for someone else to stumble upon it. And if they do, will they be ready? My name is Caleb Hawkins. I've been a park ranger for over 15 years now, working in one of the most remote forests in the country. People call it Blackwood Forest, but around here, it's known as the Whispering Woods. It's a place full of stories. Some are funny, some are sad, and some make your skin crawl. I've spent years walking these trails, knowing every tree, every sound, every smell. But even after all this time, there are parts of the forest I don't go to. Not because I'm scared, at least that's what I tell myself, but because something about them feels wrong. Like the air gets heavier, the shadows grow darker, and the silence feels alive. Tonight, it's colder than usual. The moon is full and blue, a rare celestial event that only happens once every few years. The locals say strange things happen during a blue moon in Blackwood Forest. I used to laugh it off as superstition until I started noticing things myself. Animals acting weird, strange noises at night, and people disappearing without a trace. I was sitting in my cabin near the edge of the forest when my radio crackled to life. "Caleb," said the voice on the other end. It was Sheriff Daniels. "We've got a situation. A group of college kids went missing up near Devil's Hollow." Devil's Hollow. Just hearing the name sent chills down my spine. It was one of those places people avoided unless they were looking for trouble, or trying to prove they weren't scared of old ghost stories. "They were filming some kind of documentary about local legends," Daniels continued. "We found their van abandoned near the trailhead. No sign of them." I sighed and grabbed my flashlight and gear. "I'll head out there," I said reluctantly. Something told me this wasn't going to be a normal search and rescue mission, see. I drove my truck through the winding dirt roads leading to Devil's Hollow. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trees seemed taller tonight, their branches twisting like claws against the sky. The wind carried whispers. Not words exactly, but something close enough to make me uneasy. When I reached the trailhead, their van was just sitting there. Doors, wide open like they'd left in a hurry. Inside were scattered belongings, backpacks, cameras, and notebooks filled with scribbled notes about dogmen. That's when it hit me. They were chasing one of Blackwood Forest's oldest legends. The dogmen are said to be creatures that walk on two legs but look like wolves. Huge, terrifying wolves with glowing eyes and sharp teeth. People claim they only come out during certain times of the year or under rare moons like tonight's blue moon. I shook my head and muttered under my breath, "Kids and their stupid ideas." But deep down, I wasn't laughing anymore. I followed their trail into the woods. Their footprints were easy enough to spot at first. But as I got deeper into Devil's Hollow, things started getting strange. The footprints suddenly stopped in a clearing where the ground was covered in ash-like dust. There were no signs of struggle, no broken branches or disturbed leaves, just silence. I shined my flashlight around and saw something that made my heart skip a beat. claw marks on a nearby tree trunk. They were deep and fresh, as if something huge had passed through here recently. That's when I heard it. A low growl coming from somewhere behind me. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard before. It was deeper, almost vibrating through my chest. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there. Just shadows shifting between the trees. "Get a grip," I whispered to myself, as I tightened my grip on my flashlight and kept moving forward. I kept walking deeper into the woods, following the faint trail of footprints and broken twigs. The air was colder here, and the silence felt heavier. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like you weren't alone, like something was watching you but staying just out of sight. The growl I heard earlier still echoed in my mind, but I tried to push it aside. "It's probably just a bear," I told myself, "or maybe a coyote." But even I didn't believe it. I've seen bears and coyotes plenty of times. They don't leave claw marks like the ones I saw on that tree. After about 20 minutes of walking, I reached their campsite, or what was left of it. There were tents, torn open like someone, or something, had ripped through them. Backpacks were scattered everywhere, and a small campfire had burned out completely. I crouched down near one of the tents and picked up a camera lying in the dirt. The screen was cracked, but when I pressed play, the last video started playing. At first, it was just normal stuff. The kids laughing, talking about how excited they were to film their documentary. Then, things got weird. The camera showed them, sitting around the campfire at night talking about the Dogman legend. One of them, a guy named Jake, was teasing the others, saying they were scared for no reason. "Come on," Jake said in the video, "it's just a story. There's no such thing as dogmen." But then there was a loud snap, a branch breaking somewhere in the darkness, and everyone went quiet. The camera turned toward the trees, but all you could see were shadows. "Hello?" one of them called out nervously. That's when it happened. The camera shook violently as they all started screaming. You couldn't see much, just flashes of movement and glowing eyes in the distance. Then the video cut off. I stared at the screen for a long time before putting the camera down. Whatever happened here wasn't normal. I stood up and looked around, shining my flashlight into the trees. "Jake? Sarah? Anyone?" I called out, but my voice sounded small in this endless forest. That's when I noticed something strange. Trail leading away from the campsite. It wasn't footprints this time. It was more like drag marks, as if someone, or something, had been pulled through the dirt. I followed the trail cautiously, my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness ahead. The trees seemed to close in around me, their twisted branches, reaching out like fingers. As I walked, I started noticing more signs. Broken branches, claw marks on tree trunks, and tufts of fur caught on thorns. But it wasn't normal animal fur. It was longer and darker, almost black. The trail led me to an old hunting cabin that had been abandoned for years. Its wooden walls were rotting and its windows were shattered. But there was light coming from. Inside, a faint flickering glow that made my stomach turn. I stepped onto the porch carefully. Every creak of the wood felt like it would give me away to whatever might be inside. Slowly, I pushed open the door. The cabin smelled like damp wood and something else, something metallic and sharp that made me gag. Inside were more signs of struggle, overturned furniture, bloodstains on the floorboards, and scratches on the walls. In one corner of the room was a pile of belongings, jackets, shoes, and backpacks that looked like they belonged to the missing kids. But there was no sign of them anywhere. I stepped closer to examine the pile when I heard it again, that low growl from earlier. This time it was louder and closer. I froze in place, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Slowly, I turned toward the sound. Standing in the doorway was a figure, a tall shadow with glowing eyes that pierced through the darkness like fireflies. It wasn't human, but it wasn't fully animal either. It took one step forward into the cabin's dim light, and I saw its face. sharp teeth glinting in its mouth and fur bristling along its shoulders as it stood upright on two legs like a man. I didn't wait to find out what it wanted. I bolted out of there as fast as I could, running blindly into the woods until my legs felt like they would give out. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, but it was probably just a few minutes. My legs burned, my chest ached, and every breath felt like fire in my lungs. The forest around me blurred into shadows and shapes, but I didn't dare stop. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and it wasn't friendly. Eventually, I stumbled into a clearing and collapsed to my knees. My flashlight had fallen somewhere along the way, leaving me in almost complete darkness. The moonlight was the only thing keeping me from being swallowed by the shadows. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath and calm my racing heart. "What was that?" I whispered to myself. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold on to my radio. I clicked it on and spoke into it, my voice trembling. "Sheriff Daniels, anyone. Do you copy?" Static crackled on the other end, but there was no response. I tried again. "This is Caleb Hawkins. I'm in Devil's Hollow. Something's out here. It's not an animal. It's something else." Still nothing. I cursed under my breath and shoved the radio back into my pocket. The silence around me felt heavier now, like the forest itself was holding its breath. That's when I heard it. The sound of footsteps crunching through the leaves behind me. They were slow and deliberate, like whoever or whatever was following me wanted me to know they were there. I turned around slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. At first, I didn't see anything, just trees and shadows. But then I noticed movement, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. It was tall, taller than any person I'd ever seen, and covered in dark fur that seemed to blend into the night. Its glowing eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, neither of us moved. I wanted to run again, but my body refused to listen. It was like those glowing eyes had frozen me in place. The creature stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. As it came into the moonlight, I could see it more clearly. Its face looked like a wolf's. Long snout, sharp teeth, but its body was almost human-like. It stood upright on two legs, its shoulders broad and muscular. "Stay back," I managed to whisper, though my voice sounded weak even to me. The creature tilted its head slightly as if it understood me, but instead of stopping, it took another step forward. That's when I noticed something strange about its eyes. They weren't just glowing. They seemed intelligent. Like this thing wasn't just some wild animal. It was something more. I reached for the small hunting knife strapped to my belt. Not that I thought it would do much against something this big, but before I could pull it out, the creature stopped. It stood there for a moment, staring at me with those piercing eyes. Then it let out a low growl, not threatening exactly, but more like a warning, and turned away. I watched as it disappeared into the trees, without making another sound. For a long time after that, I just sat there in the clearing trying to make sense of what had just happened. Part of me wanted to believe it was all some kind of hallucination, that maybe I'd hit my head or gotten lost in the dark and imagined everything. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever that thing was, it was real. And it wasn't alone. I don't know how long I stayed in that clearing. It could have been minutes, or it could have been hours. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what I'd just seen. Was it protecting me? Was it warning me? Or was it just toying with me? Eventually, I forced myself to stand. My legs felt like jelly, but I knew I couldn't stay there forever. Whatever that thing was, it had left for now. But something told me it wasn't gone for good. I needed answers, and I needed to find those kids. I grabbed my compass from my pocket and tried to get my bearings. The trail leading from the campsite had brought me here, but the drag marks, they kept going deeper into the forest. Part of me wanted to turn back, to head for safety and let someone else deal with this. But I couldn't do that. Not when lives were at stake. So I followed the marks. The deeper I went into the woods, the stranger everything became. The trees were older here, massive oaks with gnarled roots that twisted out of the ground like claws. The air felt thicker too, like it was harder to breathe. And then I saw it. At first, it looked like just another tree, a massive one with a trunk so wide it would take 3 people holding hands to wrap around it. But as I got closer, I realized there was something hidden beneath its roots, an opening. It was a cave. The drag marks led straight into it. I stopped at the entrance and shined my flashlight inside. The beam barely pierced the darkness, but I could see enough to know this wasn't just some animal den. The walls were smooth in places, like they'd been carved by hand. And there were markings, symbols scratched into the stone that looked ancient. I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The air was damp and cold, and every sound echoed off the walls. My footsteps, my breathing, even the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance. As I moved deeper into the cave, the symbols on the walls became more frequent and more disturbing. They showed figures standing in a circle around what looked like a giant wolf. In some of them, the wolf was standing upright like a man. There were other drawings, too, ones that showed people being dragged into the forest and changed. Their bodies twisted and stretched until they became something else, something not quite human and not quite animal. My stomach turned as I realized what these symbols might mean. This wasn't just a cave. It was some kind of ritual. Oku site. The drag marks ended in a large chamber near the back of the cave. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside, casting strange shadows on the walls. In the center of the room was a pile of bones. Animal bones mostly, but there were some that looked disturbingly human. Around them were more symbols etched into the floor, forming a circle. And then I saw it. A small camera lying near one of the bones. I picked it up carefully and pressed play on the last video file. The screen lit up with shaky footage of one of the kids, a girl named Sarah, holding the camera as she whispered frantically into it. "We found this cave," she said, her voice trembling. "Jake thought it was cool. He said we should check it out for our documentary, but something's wrong here." She turned the camera toward one of the walls showing more of those strange symbols before pointing it back at herself. "We heard noises," she continued, "growling, footsteps. They're getting closer." Suddenly, there was a loud crash in the video, and Sarah screamed as something lunged toward her from out of frame. The screen went black after that. I stared at the camera in my hands, my heart pounding in my chest. Whatever happened to Sarah and Jake, it had started here in this cave. And then I heard it again, that growl. It echoed through the chamber like thunder, low and deep enough to make my bones vibrate. Slowly, I turned toward the sound. Standing at the entrance to the chamber was another one of those creatures. But this one was different from the one I'd seen earlier. It was bigger, its fur matted with blood, and its eyes burning brighter than ever. It stepped into the room slowly, its claws clicking against the stone floor as it moved closer to me. I backed away instinctively until my back hit one of the walls. My knife felt useless in my hand. I knew there was no way I could fight something like this and win. The creature stopped just a few feet away from me and let out a low snarl that sent shivers down my spine. Its eyes locked onto mine again, just like before. And for a moment, everything else faded away. Then it did something unexpected. It turned its head slightly toward one of the other tunnels leading out of the chamber and growled again, this time louder. It wasn't looking at me anymore. It was looking past me, at something else coming down that tunnel. I froze, my back pressed against the cold stone wall of the cave. The growling from the creature in front of me grew louder, but its glowing eyes weren't on me anymore. They were fixed on the tunnel, behind me. Whatever was coming, it wasn't good. I didn't dare move. My mind raced with questions. Was it another one of those creatures? Were there more of them? What was happening here? The sound of footsteps echoed through the tunnel. Slow, and steady, like someone or something was taking its time. The creature in front of me lowered itself slightly, its muscles tensing as if it was preparing to attack. And then I saw it. Another figure emerged from the shadows of the tunnel, but this one was different. It was taller than the first creature, with fur that was almost silver under the faint light. Its movements were smoother, more controlled, not like an animal, but like something that knew exactly what it was doing. The two creatures stared at each other for a moment, their growls rumbling through the cave like thunder. I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Should I stay? My instincts told me to get out of there, but my legs refused to move. Then, something strange happened. The silver-furred creature turned its glowing eyes toward me, not with anger or hunger, but with something else, something that almost felt like curiosity. It stepped closer to me slowly, its claws clicking softly against the stone floor. The other creature backed away slightly, its growls fading into silence as if it knew this one was in charge. I tightened my grip on my knife, even though I knew it wouldn't do much good. But instead of attacking me, the silver creature stopped, just a few feet away, and crouched down slightly, its eyes level with mine. For a moment, everything else disappeared. The cave, the other creature, even my fear. All I could see were those glowing eyes staring into mine. And then, I heard a voice. It wasn't out loud. It was inside my head, clear and calm but deep enough to send shivers down my spine. "You shouldn't be here," the voice said. I blinked in shock. "What? What are you?" I whispered, not sure if I was speaking out loud or just thinking it. The creature tilted its head slightly before answering. "We are what you call dogmen," it said, "but we are not what your stories say." I stared at it, struggling to process what was happening. "You can talk." "Not as you do," the voice replied, "but we can communicate." I glanced at the other creature, the one that had been growling at me earlier, but it stayed silent, watching us carefully from a distance. "What do you want?" I asked hesitantly. The silver-furred dogman's eyes narrowed slightly. "We want to survive," it said simply. "But humans make that difficult." Its words sent a chill down my spine. "Survive? What does that mean?" It looked toward the symbols on the walls, the ones showing people being transformed into creatures, and then back at me. "We were not always this way," it said. "Long ago we were human, like you." My heart skipped a beat. You were human?" It nodded slowly. "We were changed by forces beyond your understanding, forces tied to this land and its secrets." I shook my head in disbelief. "Changed into monsters?" The dogman's growl rumbled softly at my words. Not angry exactly, but enough to make me regret saying them. "We are not monsters," it said firmly. "We are survivors." I swallowed hard and tried to keep my voice steady. "What happened to those kids? Did you hurt them?" The dogman's expression shifted slightly, its glowing eyes dimming for a moment as if it felt regret. "They came here seeking answers," it said, "but they did not understand the danger." "What danger?" I asked. It gestured toward the symbols on the walls again. "There are others like us," it said, "but not all seek peace." Glanced at the other dogman, the one that had been growling at me earlier, and realized what it meant. These creatures weren't all working together. There were factions among them. "Where are the kids now?" I asked desperately. The dogman hesitated before answering. "Some have been taken by those who wish to expand their numbers, to turn humans into more of our kind." My stomach turned at its words. And the others? "They are safe, for now," it said quietly. Before I could ask anything else, the dogman stood up and turned toward one of the tunnels leading deeper into the cave. "If you wish to save them," it said without looking back at me, "you must go further." I stared after it for a moment before glancing at the other dogman. the one that had been growling at me earlier, but it stayed where it was, watching silently as its leader disappeared into the shadows. For a long moment, I just stood there, in the cave, staring at the dark tunnel where the silver-furred dogman had disappeared. My mind was spinning. Everything it had told me sounded impossible, but after what I'd seen tonight, I couldn't dismiss it. The kids were still alive, or at least some of them were, and they were deeper in this cave. If I didn't do something, they'd be turned into things like these creatures. I took a deep breath and tightened my grip on my knife. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. "All right," I whispered to myself. "Let's get this over with." The other dogman, the one that had been growling at me earlier, was still standing near the edge of the chamber. Its glowing eyes followed me as I moved toward the tunnel. For a second, I thought it might try to stop me, but it didn't move. It just watched. The tunnel was narrow and twisted, forcing me to crouch in some places as I made my way deeper into the cave system. The air grew colder with every step, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed around me. My flashlight flickered occasionally, making the shadows dance on the walls. After what felt like an eternity, I heard something up ahead. Voices. They were faint at first, but as I got closer, they became clearer. "Help! Please, someone help! Us!" It was a girl's voice, young and desperate. My heart leapt in my chest as I quickened my pace. The tunnel opened into another chamber, this one larger than the last. In the center of the room were 3 of the missing kids, Sarah, Jake, and another boy whose name I didn't know. They were tied together with thick ropes, their faces pale and terrified. "Sarah!" I called out as I ran toward them. Her head snapped up at the sound of my voice. "Caleb! Oh my God, you're here!" I dropped to my knees beside them and began cutting through the ropes with my knife. "Are you all right?" I asked. She nodded quickly. "We're okay, for now, but they're coming back." "Who?" I asked as I worked to free Jake next. "The others," she said, her voice trembling. "The ones that took us." Before I could ask anything else, a low growl echoed through the chamber. I froze and turned toward the sound. Standing at the entrance to the room were 3 more dogmen, but these weren't like the silver-furred one that had spoken to me earlier. Their fur was darker, their eyes burned brighter, and their snarls were filled with rage. "Run!" Sarah screamed, but there was nowhere to run. The dogmen charged toward us, their claws scraping against the stone floor as they moved with terrifying speed. I barely had time to react before one of them lunged at me. I swung my knife wildly and managed to slash its arm, but it barely seemed to notice. Its claws raked across my shoulder as it knocked me to the ground. Pain shot through me as I scrambled backward, trying to put some distance between us. The other 2 dogmen were circling Sarah and Jake now, their growls growing louder with each passing second. "Stay back!" I shouted, though my voice sounded weak even to me. The dogman in front of me snarled and lunged again, but before it could reach me, something slammed into it from the side. It was the silver-furred dogman. It tackled the other creature to the ground with a force that shook the cave floor. The 2 of them snarled and snapped at each other as they rolled across the chamber in a blur of fur and claws. The other 2 dogmen hesitated for a moment before charging toward us again, but this time they didn't get far. The first dogman, the one that had been watching me earlier, appeared out of nowhere and blocked their path. It growled low and deep before lunging at them with terrifying speed. I didn't wait to see how the fight played out. I turned back to Sarah and Jake and finished cutting through their ropes as quickly as I could. "Come on," I said urgently as I helped them to their feet. "We need to get out of here." "What about them?" Sarah asked, glancing nervously at the fighting dogmen. "They'll handle it," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure if that was true. We ran toward another tunnel on the far side of the chamber, the only one that didn't seem blocked or guarded by more creatures. My shoulder throbbed with pain from where I'd been scratched earlier, but I forced myself to keep moving. The sounds of growling and snarling faded behind us as we made our way through the twisting tunnels. Eventually, we saw a faint light up. Ahead, moonlight streaming through an opening in the rocks. "Almost there," I said breathlessly as we stumbled toward it. When we finally emerged from the cave into the cool night air, it felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest. The forest around us was quiet again, eerily quiet. But for now, we were safe. We didn't stop running until we were far from the cave. My shoulder burned from the scratches, but I ignored it. The kids were exhausted, stumbling over roots and rocks in the dark, but I kept pushing them forward. I didn't know if those creatures were still following us, and I wasn't about to take any chances. Finally, we reached a clearing where the moonlight shone bright enough to see clearly. Sarah collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. Jake leaned against a tree, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "Are we safe?" Sarah asked between breaths. I glanced back toward the direction of the cave. The forest was quiet now, too quiet, but there was no sign of movement. "For now," I said. "But we need to keep going." Jake shook his head weakly. I can't. My legs feel like they're going to give out." I crouched down beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Listen to me," I said firmly. "We're not out of this yet. Those things, whatever they are, they're still out there. If we stay here, they'll find us." Sarah looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "Why is this happening? What do they want?" I hesitated for a moment before answering. "I don't know everything," I admitted, "but I think it has something to do with the blue moon." "The blue moon?" Jake repeated, frowning. I nodded. "That's what the silver-furred one told me. It said they were changed by forces, tied to this land and the moon." Sarah shivered and hugged herself tightly. "This is insane," she whispered. "It is," I agreed quietly. "But it's real." Before I could say anything else, a strange sound echoed through the clearing, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the air. "What's that?" Jake asked nervously. I turned toward the sound and saw something that made my stomach drop. Glowing symbols carved into the ground at the edge of the clearing. They looked just like the ones in the cave, and they were pulsing faintly with light. "Stay back," I said quickly as I stepped closer to inspect them. The symbols formed a large circle, and in the center was a pile of stones arranged in a strange pattern. As I stared at them, the hum grew louder, and the moonlight seemed to grow brighter. "What's happening?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said honestly, but deep down, I had a feeling this was connected to whatever ritual those creatures were trying to perform. Suddenly, the hum stopped, and everything went silent. Then, out of nowhere, a figure stepped into the clearing. It was one of the dogmen, but not like any of the ones I'd seen before. Its fur was pure white, almost glowing under the moonlight, and its eyes burned with an intensity that made my chest tighten. It stood in front of the circle of symbols and raised its head toward the sky, letting out a long howl that sent shivers down my spine. "What is it doing?" Jake whispered. "It's starting something," I said grimly. The symbols on the ground began to glow brighter as the dogman continued howling. The air around us felt heavier, charged with energy that made my skin crawl. "We have to stop it," Sarah said urgently. "How?" Jake asked helplessly. I didn't have an answer, but then I remembered something. My pocket watch. The silver-furred dogman had mentioned forces tied to this land, and somehow my old pocket watch seemed connected to all of this. It had stopped working earlier when we entered Devil's Hollow, but now it was ticking again, louder than ever. I pulled it out and stared at it for a moment before making a decision. "Stay here," I told Sarah and Jake as I stepped toward the glowing circle. "Caleb," Sarah called after me. "What are you doing?" "I'm stopping this," I said without looking back. The white-furred dogman turned toward me as I approached, its glowing eyes narrowing slightly. It let out a low growl that vibrated through my chest, but it didn't attack me right away. I held up the pocket watch and stepped closer to the circle of symbols. The glow grew brighter as I crossed into it, and for a moment, everything around me seemed to blur. The trees, the moonlight, even Sarah and Jake standing behind me. The dogman lunged toward me suddenly, but before it could reach me, the pocket watch let out a sharp chime that echoed through the clearing like a bell. The creature froze mid-step, its glowing eyes flickering for a moment before dimming slightly. I didn't know what was happening, but whatever power was tied to this watch seemed to be working against them. Using every ounce of courage I had left, I stepped closer to the center of the circle and slammed my foot down on one of the glowing stones. The hum stopped instantly, and so did everything else. The dogman let out a sharp howl before collapsing onto its knees, and then everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, everything was quiet. The glowing symbols on the ground were gone, and the air felt lighter, like whatever strange energy had been building up had vanished. I sat up slowly, my head pounding and my shoulders still throbbing. From the earlier attack, the moonlight was dimmer now, as if the blue moon had lost some of its power. "Caleb!" Sarah's voice broke through the silence. I turned to see her and Jake running toward me. Their faces were pale, but they looked relieved to see me awake. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked as she crouched beside me. "I think so," I said, though my body felt like it had been run over by a truck. "What happened?" Jake pointed toward the edge of the clearing. "They're gone," he said quietly. I followed his gaze and saw that he was right. The dogmen were nowhere to be seen. Even the white-furred one that had been performing the ritual had disappeared. "It worked," I said softly, though I wasn't entirely sure what it was. Somehow, breaking that circle of stones with the pocket watch had stopped whatever they were trying to do. But as I looked around the clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not completely. "We need to get out of here," I said as I struggled to my feet. "Now." Sarah and Jake helped me up and we started making our way back through the forest. The path was easier to follow this time, almost like the forest itself was guiding us out. By the time we reached the trailhead where their van was parked, dawn was starting to break. The first rays of sunlight peeked through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. "We made it," Jake said with a shaky laugh as he leaned against the van. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face as she hugged him tightly. "I can't believe we're alive." I leaned against a tree, trying to catch my breath. My shoulders still ached, but I didn't care. I was just glad we'd made it out. But as I looked back toward the forest, I couldn't help but feel like something, or someone, was watching us. The sheriff's department arrived not long after sunrise. Sheriff Daniels himself stepped out of his car, looking tired but relieved to see us. "Caleb," he said as he approached me. "What happened out there?" I hesitated for a moment before answering. "We found them," I said simply, nodding toward Sarah and Jake. "But there's something in those woods." Daniels frowned. "What do you mean?" I glanced back at Sarah and Jake. They were sitting in the back of an ambulance, wrapped in blankets and sipping water. They looked exhausted, but alive. "There are things out there," I said quietly. "Things that shouldn't exist." Daniels stared at me for a long moment before sighing heavily. "You've been through a lot," he said finally. "Why don't you get checked out? We'll talk more later." I nodded reluctantly and let one of the paramedics lead me toward another ambulance. But even as they cleaned up my shoulder wound and asked me questions about what happened, my mind kept going back to those creatures and what they'd told me. After everything was over and I'd been cleared to go home, I found myself sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee in hand. The forest stretched out before me, dark and quiet under the night sky. The pocket watch sat on the table beside me. It's ticking steady now, like nothing had ever been wrong with it. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands, staring at its smooth surface. Somehow, this little piece of metal had saved us, but I still didn't understand how or why. As I sat there thinking about everything that had happened, a familiar sound reached my ears, a low howl echoing through the trees. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I stared into the darkness. For a moment, nothing happened, just silence and shadows. But then, two glowing eyes appeared in the distance. They didn't come any closer. They just watched me from the edge of the forest before disappearing into the night. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at the spot where they'd been. Whatever those creatures were, whatever their purpose, I knew one thing for sure. Blackwood Forest would never be just another patch of trees to me again. It's been 6 months since that night in Blackwood Forest. 6 months since I saw those creatures, since I broke the ritual, since I walked out of those woods alive. But not a day goes by that I don't think about it. The sheriff's department filed the incident as a case of wild animal attack. That's what they told the public anyway. They said Sarah and Jake were lucky to survive and warned people to stay away from Devil's Hollow. But they didn't tell anyone about the dogman, or the cave, or the strange symbols carved into the ground. I didn't blame them. Who would believe it? Even now, I struggle to believe it myself. Sarah and Jake moved away not long after everything happened. Sarah sent me a letter once. She said she was trying to put it all behind her, but she still had nightmares about glowing eyes and growls in the dark. Jake never reached out, but I heard he's been keeping to himself, avoiding anything that reminds him of Blackwood Forest. As for me, well, I'm still here. I thought about quitting my job as a park ranger after that night. For weeks, I couldn't bring myself to step foot in those woods again. But something kept pulling me back, something I couldn't explain. The forest feels different now. It's quieter than it used to be, like it's holding its breath. The trails near Devil's Hollow are overgrown and abandoned, and even the animals seem to avoid that part of the woods. But every now and then, I hear a howl in the distance, a low, mournful sound that sends shivers down my spine. And sometimes, I see them, not often, just glimpses here and there. A pair of glowing eyes watching me from the shadows. A tall figure moving between the trees before disappearing into the darkness. They never come close. They just watch. I don't know why. They haven't attacked me again. Maybe they see me as an ally now. Or maybe they're just waiting for the right time. Either way, I've learned to live with it. The pocket watch sits on my desk at home, ticking steadily like nothing ever happened. I still don't understand how it worked or why it seemed connected to those creatures, but I keep it close anyway. It feels like some kind of protection, even if I don't know how or why. Sometimes I wonder if those creatures were telling the truth, if they really were human once. If so, what does that mean for us? Could we become like them someday? Is there something about this land, this forest, that changes people? I don't have answers to those questions. And maybe I never will, but one thing is certain. Blackwood Forest isn't just a place anymore. It's a secret, a mystery, a living thing that holds stories no one else will ever know. And as much as it scares me, part of me feels responsible for it now. So I stay here. I walk its trails every day, keeping an eye out for anything unusual. And when people ask me about Devil's Hollow or the legends of Blackwood Forest, I tell them to stay away because some stories aren't meant to be explored. Some secrets are better left alone. My name is Catherine Redfeather, but everyone calls me Kate. I've been a forest ranger for almost 10 years now, working in the Yakima National Forest. It's a place of breathtaking beauty, towering pines, crystal-clear rivers, and trails that stretch endlessly into the wilderness. But it's also a place of mystery, a place where people sometimes disappear without a trace. I've always felt connected to this forest. Maybe it's because my ancestors lived here long before it became a national park. My grandmother used to tell me stories about the land, about spirits that protected it, and others that haunted it. As a kid, I thought they were just bedtime, tales meant to scare me into behaving. But now I'm not so sure. It was late September when everything started to change. The days were getting shorter, and the air had that crisp bite that comes before winter. I was on patrol, driving my old Jeep along one of the dirt roads near the edge of the forest. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It should have been peaceful, but something felt off. The forest was too quiet. Normally, you'd hear birds chirping or squirrels rustling in the underbrush. But that evening, there was nothing, just silence. Even my radio wasn't picking up any chatter from the other rangers. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter and telling myself it was just my imagination. As I rounded a bend in the road, I saw something that made me stop cold. There was a deer standing in the middle of the path, staring straight at me. Its eyes were wide and glassy like it was frozen in fear. But what really caught my attention was its neck. It looked broken, bent at an unnatural angle. Yet, somehow, it was still standing. I didn't move for what felt like forever, just sitting there with my headlights shining on this poor creature. Then, without warning, it bolted into the trees, moving so fast I barely had time to react. My heart was pounding. As I watched it vanish into the darkness, I shook my head and tried to laugh it off. "Get a grip, Kate," I muttered to myself as I started driving again. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That feeling stayed with me all evening as I finished my patrol and headed back to the ranger station. Little did I know, that deer was just the beginning. The next morning started like any other. I arrived at the ranger station early, made myself a cup of coffee, and went over the day's schedule. We were a small team, just me and 2 other rangers, Mike and Sarah. They were already out on patrol, so it was quiet in the station. Around mid-morning, the phone rang. It was a call from the local sheriff's office. A group of anthropologists who had been camping in the forest hadn't checked in for 3 days. Their families were worried, and now it was our job to find them. I grabbed my gear, a flashlight, a map, my radio, and headed out to their last known location. According to their permit, they'd been studying ancient Native American sites deep in the forest. I couldn't help but feel uneasy as I drove toward the area. This wasn't the first time someone had gone missing in these woods. It took me about an hour to reach their campsite. As soon as I stepped out of the Jeep, I knew something was wrong. The site was completely abandoned. Their tents were still set up, but they looked like they'd been torn apart from the inside. Papers and notebooks were scattered everywhere, flapping in the breeze. I started looking around, calling out their names. "Dr. Hayes? Dr. Reyes? Anyone here?" But there was no answer. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. Then I noticed something strange near one of the tents, a circle of stones with ashes in the middle, like a fire pit. But this wasn't an ordinary campfire. The ashes were mixed with something dark and sticky, something that looked like blood. I crouched down to get a closer look when I saw something else. Symbols carved into the stones around the fire pit. They looked ancient, like something you'd see in an old history book. My stomach turned as I realized these weren't just random carvings, they were deliberate. As I stood up, my foot hit something hard. It was a small voice recorder, half buried in the dirt. I picked it up and pressed play. At first, all I could hear was static. Then a man's voice came through, shaky and panicked. "We shouldn't have done it. We shouldn't have gone into that cave. It's watching us. It knows." The recording cut off abruptly after that. A chill ran down my spine as I looked around the empty campsite again. What cave? What had they found out here? I decided to gather up their belongings. Field notes, cameras, anything that might give us a clue, and head back to the station. As I packed up their equipment, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me from the trees. When I finally got back to the station and started going through their notes, things only got stranger. Their journals mentioned finding an ancient cave hidden behind a waterfall deep in the forest. They described strange markings on the walls and what they called ritual objects. One entry stood out to me. The locals warned us not to go near it, said it was cursed, but we couldn't resist. The last entry was dated 3 days ago. The same day they disappeared. I sat back in my chair, staring at their notes spread out on my desk. My heart was racing as questions swirled through my mind. What had they found in that cave? And where were they now? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those symbols carved into the stones and heard that voice on the recorder. It's watching us. It knows. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of something far worse than I could have imagined. The next day, I decided to visit the area mentioned in the anthropologist's notes, the cave behind the waterfall. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like I had to go. Maybe it was my duty as a ranger, or maybe it was just curiosity. Either way, I packed my gear and headed out early in the morning. The drive to the waterfall was uneventful, but as soon as I stepped out of the Jeep, that uneasy feeling returned. The forest felt wrong. The air was heavy, like it was pressing down on me, and the silence was deafening. Even the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt felt out of place. I followed the trail toward the waterfall, keeping my eyes peeled for anything unusual. The notes had described a narrow path leading behind the falls, so I looked for that first. It didn't take long to find it, a hidden opening covered by thick moss and vines. As I stepped through the curtain of water, I felt a sudden chill run down my spine. The cave was dark and damp, with walls covered in strange markings. They looked similar to the symbols I'd seen at the campsite, but more intricate, almost alive. My flashlight flickered as I moved deeper inside, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. At first, all I found were broken pottery pieces and old bones scattered on the ground. But then I saw something that made me freeze. A pile of animal skins stacked neatly in one corner. They were fresh, still bloody, and they smelled awful, like rot and decay. I took a step back, trying to steady my breathing. That's when I heard it. A low growl coming from deeper in the cave. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make every hair on my body stand on end. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" No answer, just another growl, this time closer. I turned around and started walking back toward the entrance as quickly as I could without running. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move in the shadows. A figure crouched low to the ground with glowing eyes. I didn't wait to find out what it was. By the time I reached my Jeep, my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. I jumped in and slammed the door shut, locking it out of instinct. As I started driving back to the station, strange things began happening. The road ahead seemed longer than usual, stretching endlessly into darkness even though it should have been a short drive. My radio crackled with static before cutting out completely. Then came the whispers. Soft at first, but growing louder with every mile. They sounded like voices overlapping each other, speaking in a language I didn't understand. At one point, they got so loud that I had to pull over just to catch my breath. "Get a grip," I whispered to myself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "It's just your imagination." But deep down, I knew it wasn't. When I finally reached the station and stepped inside, everything felt off again. The lights flickered like they were struggling to stay on, and there was an odd smell in the air, something metallic and sharp. I tried to focus on sorting through more of the anthropologist's belongings, but couldn't shake that feeling of being watched. Every time I looked up from their notes or photos, it felt like someone, or something, was standing just outside my window. That night was one of the longest nights of my life. Even after locking every door and window in my cabin and turning on all the lights, sleep refused to come. Every creak of wood or rustle of leaves outside sent my heart racing, and then came the knocking, soft at first but growing louder with each tap. I didn't open the door. The knocking didn't stop for what felt like hours. It was steady, rhythmic, tap, 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 like someone was trying to get my attention but didn't want to scare me. But I was already terrified. I sat on the edge of my bed, clutching the flashlight in one hand and my radio in the other. I kept telling myself it was just the wind or maybe a branch hitting the door, but deep down, I knew better. Something was out there. When the sun finally rose, the knocking stopped. I waited a few more minutes before gathering enough courage to peek outside. The forest looked normal, calm and quiet, like nothing had happened. But as I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something strange. Footprints in the dirt. They weren't human footprints, though. They were too big and oddly shaped, like a mix between a wolf's paw and a human hand. The tracks led from my door back into the forest, disappearing into the trees. I didn't have time to think about it too much because Mike called me on the radio. He sounded panicked. "Kate, you need to get over here," he said. "We found something. Something bad." I grabbed my gear and drove to the location he gave me. When I arrived, Mike and Sarah were standing near a cluster of trees, their faces pale. At first, I didn't see what they were looking at. Then I noticed it. A deer carcass hanging from one of the branches. It wasn't just any deer, though. Its body had been skinned completely, leaving only raw flesh and muscle exposed. Its head was twisted at an unnatural angle, just like the deer I'd seen on the road days earlier. What could have done this?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. Mike shook his head. "I don't know. A bear, maybe? But this doesn't look like a bear." I didn't say anything because I didn't have an answer either. All I could think about were those footprints outside my cabin and the growl I'd heard in the cave. We decided to report it to the sheriff's office and mark the area as off-limits for hikers. But, as we were leaving, something caught my eye. A piece of cloth snagged on one of the branches near the deer carcass. I pulled it down and realized it was part of a shirt that matched what one of the missing anthropologists had been wearing in their photos. My stomach dropped as I stared at it. They'd been here recently, maybe even last night. That evening, I went back to my cabin and locked myself inside again. But this time, instead of waiting for something to happen, I decided to go through more of the anthropologist's belongings. There had to be something in their notes or photos that could explain what was happening. As I flipped through their journals, one entry stood out. "We've uncovered evidence of rituals performed by ancient tribes in this area." Rituals meant to summon or bind a spirit known as a skinwalker. The locals warned us not to disturb anything inside the cave, but we couldn't resist exploring further. Skinwalker. The word sent chills down my spine. My grandmother had told me stories about skinwalkers when I was a kid. Stories about shapeshifters who could take on the form of animals or even mimic people's voices to lure them into danger. She always said they were evil spirits that should never be disturbed. I wanted to believe it was just a myth, but everything that had happened so far, the strange symbols, the skinned animals, the growling in the cave, it all lined up too perfectly with those old stories. As night fell again, I made a decision. I needed to go back to that cave and figure out what was really going on. If this thing, the skinwalker, was responsible for what happened to those anthropologists, then maybe there was still a chance to find them alive. Armed with my flashlight, a knife, and every ounce of courage I could muster, I set out into the forest once more. The trail felt different this time, darker somehow, even though it was lit by moonlight. When I reached the cave entrance, my flashlight flickered again before going out completely. My heart sank as I stood there in total darkness, listening to every sound around me, the rustling leaves, the distant howl of a coyote, and then that growl again. It was louder this time, closer, and it wasn't coming from inside the cave anymore. It was behind me. I froze. The growl behind me was low and guttural, like nothing I'd ever heard before. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Slowly, I turned around, my flashlight still dead in my hand. At first, I couldn't see anything, just shadows shifting between the trees. But then I saw it. 2 glowing eyes staring back at me from the darkness. They were too high off the ground to belong to an animal, but they didn't look human either. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer, just another growl, deeper this time. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I turned and ran as fast as I could back toward the trail. Branches scratched my arms and face as I pushed through the underbrush, but I didn't care. All I could think about was getting away from whatever was out there. When I finally reached my Jeep, I jumped in and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. As soon as the engine roared to life, I sped down the dirt road without looking back. It wasn't until I was halfway back to the ranger station that I realized something strange. My radio had started working again. Static crackled through the speakers before a familiar voice came through. "Kate," the voice said, "it's Joseph Whitefeather. We need to talk." Joseph was an elder from the Yakima tribe and one of the few people who still lived near the forest. He'd always been kind to me, sharing stories about his culture and helping me understand the land better. But something about his tone now made my stomach twist. I pulled over and grabbed the radio. "Joseph, what's going on?" There was a pause before he replied. "You've seen it, haven't you? The skinwalker." The words sent chills down my spine. I don't know what I saw," I stammered, "but something's out there." Joseph sighed heavily. "You need to come to my house right now. There are things you need to know, things your grandmother never told you." I didn't hesitate. If anyone could help me make sense of what was happening, it was Joseph. When I arrived, at his small cabin on the edge of the forest, he was already waiting for me on the porch. His face looked older than usual, lined with worry. "Come inside," he said, motioning for me to follow him. The cabin smelled of sage and wood smoke, and a fire crackled softly in the hearth. Joseph gestured for me to sit while he poured us both cups of tea. "You've stirred something ancient," he began after a long silence, "something that should have been left alone." I told him everything. The anthropologist's disappearance, the strange symbols in the cave, the skinned animals, and those glowing eyes in the forest. Joseph listened carefully before nodding slowly. "The skinwalker is a powerful spirit," he explained. "It can take on many forms, animals, people, even those you love. It feeds on fear and chaos." "But why is it here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "Because someone called it here." My breath caught in my throat as his words sank in. "The cave you found isn't just any cave," Joseph continued. "It's a sacred place where rituals were performed long ago. Rituals meant to bind spirits like the skinwalker so they couldn't harm anyone." I thought about the anthropologist's notes, their mention of rituals and warnings they'd ignored, and felt a wave of anger and dread wash over me. "They broke something when they went into that cave," Joseph said softly, "and now it's free." I stared into my cup of tea, trying to process everything he'd just told me. It sounded impossible, like something out of a horror movie, but deep down, I knew he was telling the truth. "What do we do?" I asked. Finally, Joseph sighed again and reached for a small pouch hanging on the wall. He opened it to reveal a bundle of dried herbs tied together with red string. "We have to perform a binding ritual," he said firmly, "but it won't be easy. The skinwalker will fight back and it will try to break you." His words sent another chill down my spine, but I nodded anyway. If this thing was responsible for what happened to those anthropologists, and if there was even a chance they were still alive, I had to try. The next morning, Joseph and I set out toward the cave. He insisted we travel on foot, saying it was safer that way. I wasn't sure how walking through the forest would protect us from something as terrifying as the skinwalker, but I trusted him. He seemed to know more about this than anyone else. The forest was eerily quiet as we made our way along the trail. Joseph carried a small satchel filled with herbs, stones, and other items for the ritual. I had my flashlight, a knife, and a growing sense of dread. We were about halfway to the cave when we heard it. A faint voice calling out from somewhere in the trees. "Help, please." I froze in my tracks, my heart pounding. The voice sounded weak and desperate, like someone barely clinging to life. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Joseph. He nodded but didn't stop walking. "Keep moving," he said firmly. "It's trying to distract us." I wanted to believe him, but the voice sounded so real. What if it was one of the missing anthropologists? What if they were hurt and needed help? "Help me," the voice called again, closer this time. I couldn't take it anymore. Ignoring Joseph's warning, I turned and started walking toward the sound. "Kate," Joseph hissed behind me. "Stop! It's not what you think." But I couldn't stop. The voice was pulling me forward like a magnet, leading me deeper into the trees. My flashlight flickered as I moved, casting strange shadows on the ground. Then I saw them. 2 figures huddled together near a fallen tree. At first, I thought they were dead. Their clothes were torn and their skin looked pale and sickly. But as I got closer, one of them lifted their head and looked at me. "Kate," she whispered weakly. It was Dr. Jennifer Hayes, one of the missing anthropologists. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow with fear. "Oh my God," I breathed, rushing toward her. "Are you okay? What happened?" She shook her head slowly, tears streaming down her face. We shouldn't have gone into that cave," she said in a trembling voice. "It's inside us now. We can't escape it." Her words sent chills down my spine. "What do you mean, inside you?" I asked. Before she could answer, the other figure, Dr. Thomas Reyes, lifted his head and let out a low growl. His eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, just like the ones I'd seen in the forest. "Kate!" Joseph shouted behind me. "Get away from them!" I stumbled backward as Thomas lunged toward me on all fours like an animal. His movements were jerky and unnatural, his body twisting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Joseph stepped forward and threw a handful of herbs at Thomas while chanting something under his breath. The air seemed to shimmer around us as Thomas froze mid-lunge and let out an ear-piercing scream. Jennifer crawled away from him, clutching her head as if she were in pain. "It's too late," she sobbed. "We're already gone." Joseph grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward the trail. "We can't save them," he said urgently. "They're too far gone." I wanted to argue, to say we couldn't just leave them there, but deep down, I knew he was right. Whatever had happened to them in that cave had changed them forever. As we continued toward the cave, Joseph explained what we'd just seen. "The skinwalker doesn't just kill, it corrupts," he said grimly. "It gets inside your mind and body until you're no longer yourself." His words made my stomach turn as I thought about Jennifer and Thomas and what might happen if this thing wasn't stopped. By the time we made it back to the ranger station, the sun was beginning to set. Joseph insisted we needed to prepare for the ritual immediately. He said the skinwalker was growing stronger and that the longer we waited, the harder it would be to stop it. But as I stepped inside the station, something felt wrong. The air was heavy, and there was a strange smell, like damp earth mixed with something metallic. I flicked on the lights, but they only buzzed and flickered weakly. "I'll grab my supplies," I told Joseph, trying to shake off the unease. He nodded and stayed by the door, muttering a quiet prayer under his breath. I headed toward my office, but as I turned the corner into the hallway, I froze. Standing there in front of my desk was me. At first, I thought it was a mirror or some kind of trick of the light, but then it moved. stepping forward with a slow, deliberate motion. Its face was identical to mine, down to the smallest detail. Same brown eyes, same dark hair tied back in a ponytail. But there was something off about it, something cold and lifeless in its expression. "Kate," it said in my voice, tilting its head slightly, "why are you afraid?" My heart felt like it had stopped beating. I couldn't move or speak. I just stood there, staring at this thing wearing my face. "Don't you trust yourself?" it asked, taking another step closer. Its smile widened unnaturally, stretching too far across its face. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. "Joseph!" I shouted, my voice trembling. Within seconds, Joseph appeared behind me. He took one look at the doppelganger and immediately pulled a bundle of herbs from his satchel. He lit them with a match and began chanting in a language I didn't understand. The doppelganger's smile vanished instantly. Its eyes darkened, turning pitch black as it let out an ear-piercing screech. The sound was so loud that I had to cover my ears. "Don't look at it," Joseph yelled over the noise. "It's trying to get inside your head." I squeezed my eyes shut as Joseph continued chanting. The air around us felt like it was vibrating, and the smell of burning herbs filled my nose. The screeching grew louder, and more distorted before suddenly cutting off. When I opened my eyes again, the doppelganger was gone. I collapsed onto the floor, my whole body shaking. What was that?" I managed to whisper. Joseph knelt beside me, his expression grim. "The skinwalker is testing you," he said quietly. "It knows you're trying to stop it." I stared at him in disbelief. It can look like me." He nodded solemnly. "It can take on any form, animal or human. It uses your fears and doubts against you." I felt sick to my stomach as his words sank in. If this thing could mimic me so perfectly, how would I know if I was ever looking at the real me? Or someone else? Joseph helped me to my feet and handed me a small pouch filled with herbs similar to what he'd just burned. "Keep this with you at all times," he said firmly. "It won't stop the skinwalker completely, but it will weaken its influence." I clutched the pouch tightly in my hand, feeling a small sense of comfort from its earthy scent. "We don't have much time," Joseph continued. "The skinwalker knows we're close to stopping it, and it will do everything in its power to stop us first." As we gathered our supplies for the ritual and prepared to head back into the forest one final time, I couldn't shake the feeling that this battle wasn't just about stopping an ancient spirit anymore. It was about surviving long enough to face it. Joseph and I spent the next few hours preparing for the ritual. He explained everything carefully, making sure I understood each step. The ritual wasn't just about stopping the skinwalker, it was about binding it back to the cave where it had been trapped for centuries. But it would take both of us working together, and even then, Joseph warned me that it wouldn't be easy. "The skinwalker will try to stop us," he said as he laid out the items we'd need. A circle of stones, bundles of herbs, and a small bowl filled with a dark liquid. "It will use everything it has to break your focus. You have to stay strong." I nodded, clutching the pouch of herbs he'd given me earlier. "What happens if we fail?" I asked quietly. Joseph didn't answer right away. He just looked at me with an expression that said more than words ever could. As night fell, we set out into the forest once again. This time, the air felt heavier than before, almost suffocating. The trees seemed taller, their branches reaching out like claws. Every sound, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant howl of a coyote, felt amplified. We reached the cave just as the moon rose high in the sky. Its pale light reflected off the waterfall, casting eerie shadows on the rocks. Joseph motioned for me to follow him inside. The cave was colder than I remembered, and the strange markings on the walls seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Joseph began setting up the ritual circle near the pile of animal skins I'd seen earlier. He placed the stones in a perfect ring and lit the bundles of herbs with a small match. "Stand here," he instructed, pointing to a spot inside the circle. "Once we start, you can't leave this space, no matter what happens." I nodded and stepped into the circle, my heart pounding in my chest. Joseph began chanting in his native language, his voice steady and strong. The air seemed to hum with energy as he sprinkled the dark liquid onto the stones. The smell of burning herbs filled my nose, sharp and earthy. At first, nothing happened. The cave was silent except for Joseph's chanting and the crackle of flames from the herbs. But then I felt it, a presence in the air, heavy and oppressive. The growling started softly at first, echoing from somewhere deep within the cave. It grew louder with each passing moment until it felt like it was surrounding us completely. "Don't look away," Joseph said firmly as he continued chanting. "It's trying to distract you." I gripped my flashlight tightly, forcing myself to stay focused on Joseph's voice. But then I heard something else, my grandmother's voice calling my name. "Kate," she said softly from somewhere behind me. "Why are you doing this? Come home." I froze. My grandmother had passed away years ago, but her voice sounded so real, so familiar, that it made my chest ache. "Kate," she called again, closer this time. I turned my head slightly toward the sound before catching myself. "No," I whispered under my breath. "You're not real." The growling grew louder as if it were angry at my resistance. Shadows began shifting on the walls of the cave, forming shapes that looked like animals, wolves, deer, but twisted and unnatural. Joseph's chanting grew louder as he threw more herbs onto the flames. "Stay strong," he shouted over the noise. Suddenly, one of the shadows lunged toward me, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. It wasn't just a shadow anymore, it was real. The skinwalker stood before me in its true form, a horrifying mix of human and animal features. Its limbs were long and thin like branches, its face stretched into a grotesque smile with sharp teeth glinting in the firelight. It spoke in a voice that sounded like mine. "You can't stop me." I clenched my fists and shouted back, "You're wrong!" Joseph threw one final handful of herbs onto the flames as his chanting reached its peak. The air around us shimmered with energy as a blinding light filled the cave. The skinwalker let out an ear-piercing scream as its form began to dissolve into smoke. The shadows on the walls faded away one by one until there was nothing left but silence. When it was over, Joseph collapsed onto his knees, breathing heavily. I stepped out of the circle cautiously, still clutching my flashlight. Did we do it?" I asked hesitantly. Joseph nodded weakly but didn't say anything right away. He looked exhausted but relieved. As we left the cave and stepped back into the moonlit forest, I couldn't help but feel like something had shifted, not just in the air around us but within me as well. The forest was quiet as we stepped out of the cave, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that made you feel at peace. It was heavy, like the world was holding its breath. Joseph walked ahead of me, his steps slow and deliberate. He looked drained, like the ritual had taken everything out of him. I wanted to believe it was over, that we had bound the skinwalker back to the cave, but something didn't feel right. The air was still thick with that oppressive energy, and my gut told me we weren't safe yet. "Joseph," I said softly, catching up to him, "are you sure it worked?" He stopped and turned. To me, his face pale in the moonlight. "It worked," he said, but there was hesitation in his voice. At least, it should have. I didn't like the way he said that. "What do you mean, should have?" I asked. Before he could answer, a sound echoed through the trees, a low growl that made my blood run cold. It was coming from behind, us near the cave. Joseph's eyes widened as he grabbed my arm. "Run," he said urgently. We took off down the trail, our footsteps pounding against the dirt. The growling grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right behind us. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. "Keep going," Joseph shouted as we reached a clearing in the forest. But then I heard it, a voice calling my name again. This time, it wasn't my grandmother's voice or even mine. It was my father's. "Kate," he said softly from somewhere in the darkness. "It's me." I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart racing. My father had passed away when I was a teenager, but his voice sounded so real, so familiar, that it made my chest ache. "Kate," he called again, stepping into the moonlight. It looked just like him, the same kind eyes, the same warm smile, but I knew better now. This wasn't my father, it was the skinwalker. "Don't listen to it," Joseph shouted behind me. "It's trying to break you." But I couldn't move. The skinwalker took another step toward me, its form shifting slightly as if it were struggling to hold its shape. "You don't have to fight anymore," it said in my father's voice. "Just come with me." Tears filled my eyes as I clenched my fists. "You're not real," I whispered through gritted teeth. The skinwalker's smile twisted into something cruel as its form began to change again. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, its face contorting into a grotesque mix of human and animal features. "You think you can stop me?" it hissed, its voice no longer resembling my father's. "You're nothing." Joseph stepped forward and threw another handful of herbs at the creature while chanting loudly. The skinwalker let out a deafening screech as smoke rose from its body, but it didn't retreat this time. "It's too strong," Joseph shouted over the noise. "We need to finish this now." I nodded and reached for the pouch of herbs he'd given me earlier. My hands were shaking as I lit them with a match and threw them toward the creature. The air around us shimmered again as Joseph continued chanting. The skinwalker writhed in pain, its form flickering between shapes, animals, people, even Jennifer and Tomas. "Don't let it distract you," Joseph yelled. I focused all my energy on staying strong, forcing myself to ignore the images flashing before me. The creature lunged toward us one last time before collapsing onto the ground in a heap of smoke and shadows. For a moment, everything was silent except for our heavy breathing. Then Joseph spoke. "It's done." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But something still felt wrong. The oppressive energy hadn't lifted completely, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't seen the last of the skinwalker. As we made our way back toward the ranger station, Joseph explained what had happened. "The ritual weakened it," he said quietly. "But spirits like this don't die easily." I stared at him in disbelief. "So, what does that mean? Is it still out there?" He nodded solemnly. "It's bound to this land now, trapped here, but it will always be watching." His words sent chills down my spine as I thought about all. The hikers who would come through this forest in the future, all the people who wouldn't know what lurked in its shadows. When we finally reached the station, Joseph turned to me with a serious expression. "You need to leave this place," he said firmly. "The skinwalker knows you now. It will never stop trying to break you." I wanted to argue, to say that this forest was my home, but deep down I knew he was right. The next morning, I packed up my things and left Yakama National Forest for good. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance at the trees one last time, wondering if those glowing eyes were watching me go. Even now, years later, I still dream about that night. The growling in the cave, the doppelganger at the station, and those voices calling my name from the darkness. Some nights are worse than others, when I wake up sweating and gasping for air, but one thing is certain. I'll never forget what happened in Yakama National Forest, or what still waits there in its shadows. My name is Vince Mercer, and I've spent most of my life chasing answers to questions no one else seems to care about. I'm not a detective, not a journalist, and definitely not some kind of adventurer. I'm just a guy who can't let things go, especially when they don't make sense. And nothing makes less sense than Blackwater Lake. Blackwater Lake sits deep in the Adirondack Mountains, far from any town or city. It's the kind of place that doesn't show up on most maps. The locals call it cursed, and honestly, I can't blame them. Over the years, people have gone missing there. Campers, hikers, even entire families. And no one has ever found a trace of them. No bodies, no belongings, nothing. It's like they just vanished into thin air. I first heard about the lake when I was a kid. My dad used to tell me stories about it when we went camping in the mountains. He'd say things like, "Stay away from Blackwater Lake. It's not just water, it's alive." At the time, I thought he was just trying to scare me into staying close to camp. But as I got older, I started hearing more about it. Whispers in town about strange lights over the water at night, animals avoiding it like they could sense something wrong. The lake isn't big or particularly beautiful. The water is dark and murky, almost black, which is how it got its name. Trees surround it on all sides, their gnarled roots twisting into the earth like claws trying to hold on for dear life. There's always this heavy mist hanging over it, even on sunny days. And at night, forget it. The place feels like something out of a nightmare. I never thought I'd have a reason to go near Blackwater Lake myself, until 3 years ago when my world fell apart. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip with my wife, Sarah, and our 6-year-old daughter, Emily. We weren't even planning to go near Blackwater Lake. We were miles away from it. But one evening, Emily wandered off while we were setting up camp. We searched for hours, calling her name until our voices were hoarse, but she was gone. The search teams found nothing. No footprints, no signs of struggle, just nothing. It was like she had been swallowed by the forest itself. And then someone mentioned Blackwater Lake. At first, I refused to believe it had anything to do with Emily's disappearance. But as time went on and the police closed the case as unsolved, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. Something no one wanted to talk about. So here I am now, 3 years later, standing at the edge of Blackwater Lake with nothing but a backpack full of supplies and a head full of questions. The air smells damp and heavy, like rain is coming even though the sky is clear. The water ripples slightly even though there's no wind. I don't know what I'm expecting to find here. Maybe answers, maybe closure, or maybe just proof that my dad was right all along. This place isn't just water, it's something else entirely. And whatever it is, it's waiting for me. My name is Vince Mercer, and I've never been the kind of person who believes in ghosts or monsters. I'm a scientist, or at least I used to be. Before everything fell apart, I worked as a researcher studying ecosystems, how water, plants, and animals all connect to keep nature alive. My job was about facts and evidence, not myths or legends. But Blackwater Lake, it doesn't care about facts. After Emily disappeared, my life stopped making sense. Sarah, my wife, couldn't handle it. She blamed herself for letting Emily wander off, even though it wasn't her fault. We tried to hold on to each other, but grief has a way of breaking things that were once strong. She left 6 months after. Emily vanished, and I didn't stop her. What could I say? I couldn't fix anything. I quit my job not long after that. Every time I looked at a lake or river during my research trips, all I could think about was Emily. Where was she? Was she scared? Did she call out for me? The questions never stopped and no one had answers. So I started looking for them myself. That's how I ended up here, standing at the edge of Blackwater Lake with nothing but my backpack and a flashlight. Over the past 3 years, I've read every story about this place that I could find. Some of them are ridiculous, like the one about aliens living underwater, but others feel too real to ignore. There's one story that keeps coming back to me. The crawlers. The locals say the crawlers are what take people at Blackwater Lake. They're not human, not anymore, but they used to be. According to the legend, anyone who disappears here becomes one of them. They live in the water now, pulling others into their world beneath the surface. No one knows why they do it or how they choose their victims. It sounds crazy, right? Like something out of a horror movie. But here's the thing. Every single person who's gone missing at Blackwater Lake has something in common. They were alone when it happened. That's why I came here alone tonight. I don't know if I believe in the crawlers or any of the other stories about this place, but if there's even a chance they're real, maybe they'll show themselves to me. Maybe they'll tell me what happened to Emily. The sun is starting to set now, and the mist over the lake is getting thicker. It's quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my own breathing and the occasional ripple in the water. I take out my flashlight and shine it across the lake's surface. Nothing moves except for the mist swirling in slow circles like it has a mind of its own. My heart is pounding harder than it should be. I tell myself it's just nerves. But deep down, I know something isn't right here. I take a step closer to the water's edge and kneel down, trying to get a better look at what lies beneath the surface. The water is so dark that it feels like staring into an endless void. My reflection looks back at me, distorted by ripples, but then something else catches my eye. It's faint, just a flicker, but for a moment, I think I see movement below the surface. Something long and pale gliding through the water like a shadow. I freeze, holding my breath as my flashlight shakes in my hand. It could be a fish, or maybe just my imagination playing tricks on me, but then it happens again. Another flicker of movement, closer this time. I don't know what's down there, but whatever it is, it knows I'm here. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. After seeing the flicker of movement in the water, my mind wouldn't stop racing. What was it? A fish? A trick of the light? Or something else entirely? I stayed by the lake until the mist grew so thick I couldn't see my own hands. Then I backed away, set up camp a little farther into the woods, and sat there in silence, listening. The forest around Blackwater Lake isn't like other forests. It's quiet. Too quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, no distant hoots from owls. Just silence. It's the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched, even when you know you're alone. I spent most of the night staring at the fire, trying to convince myself I hadn't seen anything unusual. But deep down, I knew better. Something was out there. Something that didn't belong. The next morning, I decided to explore the area around the lake. If I was going to find answers, I couldn't just sit around waiting for them to come to me. So I packed up my gear and started walking along the shoreline, keeping my eyes on the water. That's when I found it. The first clue. It was a shoe, half buried in the mud near the edge of the lake. A child's shoe. My breath caught in my throat as I knelt down to pick it up. It was old, worn, and faded, but it looked like it had belonged to a little girl. My heart started racing as I turned it over in my hands, searching for some kind of sign that it might have been Emily's. But it wasn't hers. The size was wrong, and there was no way she'd have been wearing something this old. Still, finding a child's shoe here felt like more than just a coincidence. I kept walking, scanning the ground for anything else that might tell me what had happened here. And then I found something else. A backpack lying in a patch of tall grass near the water's edge. It looked newer than the shoe, like it hadn't been there for long. When I opened it, my stomach dropped. Inside were snacks, a water bottle, and a folded map. All things someone might take on a hike or camping trip. But what really caught my attention was a notebook tucked into one of the pockets. The name Cooper was written on the cover in neat handwriting. I flipped through the pages quickly, my hands shaking as I read bits and pieces of what was written inside. Arrived at Blackwater Lake today. Beautiful spot for camping. Saw strange lights over the water last night. Probably just fireflies. Heard something moving outside our tent. Checked, but didn't see anything. The entries stopped abruptly after that. I remembered hearing about a family named Cooper who had gone missing near Blackwater Lake years ago, a father, mother, and their 2 kids. They'd been camping here for a weekend trip and never came home. Search teams had combed through the area but found nothing, not even their tent or supplies. And now here I was holding their backpack. My chest tightened as I looked out at the lake again. What had happened to them? Had they wandered too close? To the water? Had they seen something they shouldn't have? I didn't know what to think anymore. All I knew was that this wasn't normal. None of it was, and if I wanted answers, I'd have to keep digging. I couldn't stop thinking about the backpack and the shoe. They weren't just random objects. They were pieces of someone's life, someone who had vanished without a trace. And now they were here, at Blackwater Lake, waiting to be found. It felt like the lake was trying to tell me something, but I didn't know how to listen. I spent the rest of the day walking around the lake, looking for more clues. The mist never left. It clung to the water like a blanket, heavy and suffocating. Every now and then, I thought I saw something move in the distance, a shadow slipping, through the trees or a ripple in the water, but when I looked closer, there was nothing there. By late afternoon, I decided to take a break. I sat down on a fallen log near the shore and pulled out my notebook. Over the past few years, I'd written down everything I could find about Blackwater Lake. Stories from locals, old newspaper articles, even bits of folklore passed down through generations. Most of it sounded like nonsense. Ghosts, curses, creatures lurking beneath the surface, but some of it felt too real to ignore. There were patterns in the stories, things that kept coming up again and again. The first was the mist. People always mentioned it. The way it hung over the water no matter what time of day it was, how it seemed to move on its own like it was, alive. Some said it was just a natural phenomenon caused by the lake's temperature or depth, but others believed it was something more, something unnatural. The second pattern was the disappearances. They weren't random. They followed a strange kind of logic. People who vanished here were always alone when it happened. Hikers walking ahead of their group, campers wandering off to find firewood, kids exploring while their parents set up camp, and they were always near the water. The third pattern was older, much older. It came from stories told by indigenous tribes who lived in this area long before settlers arrived. They called Blackwater Lake the place where shadows live. According to their legends, the lake wasn't just water, it was a doorway to another world. A world where people could disappear and never come back. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Was there something supernatural about this place? Or was it just a series of coincidences that had spiraled into myth over time? Either way, I couldn't ignore what I'd seen, or what I'd found. As I sat there staring at my notes, I heard something. A sound so faint I almost missed it. It wasn't coming from the forest or the trees, it was coming from the lake. It sounded like humming. I froze, my heart pounding as I strained to hear more. The humming grew louder. Not music exactly, but something rhythmic and strange, like voices blending together in a low chant. It seemed to rise from deep within the water, echoing across its surface. I stood up slowly, my eyes fixed on the lake as the sound grew louder still. The mist swirled in strange patterns now, circles and spirals that made my head spin if I looked at them too long. And then, silence. The humming stopped so suddenly it felt like someone had cut off all sound in the world at once. The mist settled, back into place as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. I could feel it in my bones. Blackwater Lake wasn't just a place where people disappeared. It was alive, somehow, watching me, waiting for me to make my next move. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The lake felt alive, like it had eyes hidden in the mist, following my every move. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. This wasn't just a place, it was something else entirely. As the sun began to set, I decided to stay close to the water. If I wanted answers, I couldn't keep running away every time things got strange. So I set up camp right on the shoreline, with my tent facing the lake. It felt like a bad idea, but I didn't care anymore. I needed to know what was out there. The mist grew thicker as night fell, wrapping around me like a cold blanket. The air smelled damp and heavy, and every sound seemed louder than it should have been. The crackle of my fire, the rustle of leaves, even my own breathing. I kept my flashlight close, shining it across the water every few minutes. At first, nothing happened. The lake stayed quiet, its surface smooth and still like a sheet of glass. But then, just as I was starting to relax, I saw it. Movement in the water. It was faint at first, just ripples breaking the surface near the middle of the lake. But as I watched, the ripples grew larger, spreading outward in slow circles. Something was moving beneath the water. Something big. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the spot where the ripples were coming from. The beam cut through the mist, but it didn't reach far enough to show what was causing them. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. And then I heard it again. The humming. It started low and quiet like before, but this time it was closer. So close I could feel it vibrating in my chest. It wasn't just sound. It was something deeper, something that made my skin crawl and my stomach twist into knots. I stood frozen by the fire, staring at the lake as the humming grew louder. The ripples turned into waves now, crashing against the shore like something was trying to climb out of the water. And then I saw them. At first, they looked like shadows. Long and thin, gliding through the mist like they were part of it. But as they got closer, their shapes became clearer. They weren't human, not anymore. Their bodies were pale and slick like they'd been underwater for too long. Their arms were too long, their fingers stretched into claws that dragged across the ground as they moved. Their faces were worse, blank and smooth with no eyes or mouths, just hollow indentations where features should have been. But somehow I knew they could see me. I stumbled backward as one of them stepped out of the water onto the shore. It moved slowly, its head tilting from side to side like it was studying me. The others followed behind it. 3. No, 4 of them. All. Moving in perfect silence except for that awful humming. I wanted to run, to grab my backpack and disappear into the woods, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like they'd rooted themselves to the ground while my brain screamed at me to get away. And then one of them stopped and spoke. It didn't have a mouth. I don't know how it made sound, but I heard words clear as day. "You're looking for her." My breath caught in my throat as its head tilted toward me again. Emily. It had to mean Emily. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My voice felt trapped inside me like everything else. The fear, the questions, all stuck in a knot that wouldn't come undone. The creature raised one clawed hand and pointed toward the lake's center. "She is waiting." I don't remember how long I stood there, frozen, staring at the creatures. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. They weren't attacking me. They weren't chasing me. They were just standing there, watching, waiting. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they began to retreat. One by one, the creatures slipped back into the water, their pale bodies disappearing beneath the surface without a sound. The humming faded with them, leaving behind an eerie silence that felt heavier than before. I wanted to run, to leave this place and never come back, but something kept me rooted to the spot. "She is waiting." Those words echoed in my head, over and over again. Could it really be true? Could Emily still be alive somewhere in this nightmare? If there was even a chance, I had to find her. I packed up my camp and started walking along the shoreline again, keeping my flashlight aimed at the water. The mist seemed thicker now, swirling around me like it was trying to pull me closer to the lake. I tried to ignore it, and focus on finding anything that could lead me to Emily. That's when I saw it, a building hidden in the trees near the edge of the lake. It wasn't big, just a small concrete structure with moss growing over its walls and vines creeping up its sides. It looked abandoned, like no one had been there in years, but something about it felt wrong. The door was slightly ajar, hanging crooked on its hinges like someone had forced it open. I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The air inside was damp and cold, smelling faintly of mildew and rust. My flashlight flickered as I moved. Through the narrow hallway, its beam cutting through the darkness to reveal peeling paint and broken tiles. It looked like some kind of research station. Old equipment scattered across tables, wires dangling from the ceiling. I stopped when I saw a stack of folders sitting on one of the desks. They were covered in dust, but when I brushed it off, I saw a logo stamped on the front. Blackwater Lake Biological Research Facility. My stomach twisted as I opened the first folder and started reading. The papers inside were reports, detailed. Accounts of experiments conducted at Blackwater Lake years ago. They talked about studying the lake's unique ecosystem. But as I flipped through more pages, things took a darker turn. Subject shows signs of physical transformation after prolonged exposure to lake water. Behavioral changes observed. Heightened, yet aggression and loss of speech. Further testing required to determine long-term effects. I felt sick as I read those words. This wasn't just a research station, it was a testing facility. They hadn't been studying Blackwater Lake. They'd been experimenting on people. I found more folders buried under piles of equipment, photos of test subjects with pale skin and elongated limbs, diagrams showing changes in their anatomy over time. It was all connected. The disappearances, the creatures in the lake, they were people once, people who had been transformed into something else. And then I found something that stopped me cold, a photo of Dr. Levine. He had been one of my mentors years ago when I first started working as a researcher. He was brilliant but secretive, always keeping his work close to his chest. I hadn't seen him in years, not since he left our lab without explanation. But now here he was, tied to Blackwater Lake. The photo showed him standing next to one of the test subjects, a young girl with pale skin and hollow eyes. My hands shook as I stared at her face. It wasn't Emily, but she couldn't have been much older than her. What had he done? What had they done? The sound of water dripping snapped me out of my thoughts. It was coming from deeper inside the building. A slow, steady drip echoing through the hallway like footsteps. I turned toward the sound, gripping my flashlight tighter as I moved closer. Whatever was waiting for me, I wasn't ready for it. I followed the sound of dripping water deeper into the building. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the air itself was pushing against me. My flashlight flickered again, its beam struggling to cut through the darkness. I told myself it was just old batteries, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The hallway led to a large room at the back of the building. The walls were lined with tanks, massive glass containers filled with murky water. Most of them were empty, but a few had shapes floating inside. I stepped closer, my heart pounding as I shone my flashlight on one of the tanks. What I saw made me stumble back. Inside was a creature, pale and distorted. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long. Its skin looked almost translucent, like it had been underwater for years. But what made my stomach twist was its face. It wasn't blank like the ones I'd seen near the lake. It had features, human features, but they were warped, twisted, into something unrecognizable. I stared at it, unable to look away. Was this what happened to the people who disappeared here? Was this what Blackwater Lake did to them? The dripping sound grew louder, pulling my attention away from the tank. It was coming from a corner of the room where another tank stood, larger than the others and covered in condensation. I moved closer, wiping away the fog on the glass with my sleeve. Inside was a man. He looked human, mostly, but his skin was pale and his eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead like he couldn't see me. His arms were pressed against the glass, his fingers clawing at it weakly as if he was trying to escape. I felt a lump rise in my throat as I realized who he was. Dr. Levine. I stepped back, my mind racing. He had been part of this, part of whatever experiments they'd been doing here, but now he was trapped in one of their tanks, transformed into something barely human. Suddenly, his head turned toward me. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw recognition in them. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out, just bubbles rising to the surface of the water. I stumbled back farther, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I didn't know what to do. How could I help him? Was there even a way to reverse what had happened? Before I could think of anything else, I felt it. A sharp pain in my arm. I looked down and saw a thin scratch running across my skin. It wasn't deep, but it burned like fire. My heart started racing as I realized where it had come from. The glass on one of the tanks had cracked when I wiped it clean earlier. The water inside had leaked out, and now it was on me. I tried to wipe it off with my sleeve, but it didn't help. The burning spread up my arm and into my chest, making it harder to breathe. My vision blurred as I stumbled out of the room and into the hallway, clutching my arm tightly. I didn't know what was happening to me, but I could feel it. Something inside me was changing. The air felt heavier now, pressing against me like a weight I couldn't escape. My legs felt weak, my skin tingling as if tiny needles were pricking every inch of me. And then I heard it again. The humming. It wasn't coming from outside or from the tanks. It was coming from inside. Me. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air as the humming grew louder in my ears. My vision went dark for a moment before flickering, back on. Only now everything looked different. The colors were sharper, brighter somehow, and I could see things moving in the mist that hadn't been there before. I wasn't just changing physically, I was starting to see things differently, too. Whatever Blackwater Lake had done to those people, it was happening to me now. I don't know how long I lay there on the cold, damp floor of the research station. Minutes? Hours? Time didn't feel real anymore. My body ached, my skin burned, and the humming in my head wouldn't stop. It was like a song I couldn't escape, pulling me toward something I didn't understand. When I finally managed to sit up, I realized the burning sensation in my arm had faded. But something was different. My hand didn't look like mine anymore. The skin was paler, almost translucent, and when I moved my fingers, they felt wrong, longer, stronger. Panic bubbled up inside me as I stared at my hand. Was this what had happened to the others? Was I turning into one of them? I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight, like the air around me was too thick to breathe, and then I heard it. A voice. It wasn't coming from the room or the hallway. It was inside my head, soft and distant, but clear enough to understand. Come to us. The words sent a chill down my spine. They weren't a command. They were an invitation. And as much as I wanted to ignore them, I couldn't. Something, deep inside me, something I didn't recognize, was pulling me toward the lake. I stumbled out of the building and into the misty night. The air felt colder now, sharper against my skin. The lake stretched out before me, dark and endless, its surface rippling gently like it was alive. The voice came again, louder this time. Come to us. Before I knew what I was doing, I was walking toward the water. My legs felt heavy, but they moved on their own, carrying me closer and closer until my boots touched the edge of the lake. I stopped for a moment, staring at my reflection in the water. It wasn't mine anymore. My face looked thinner, my eyes darker, and my skin, it wasn't human. Not completely. The humming grew louder as I stepped into the water. It was cold, so cold it made my teeth chatter, but I kept going. Step by step. The water rose higher until it reached my chest. And then I sank. The water closed over my head like a curtain falling on a stage. For a moment, everything was dark and silent except for the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. But as I opened my eyes, the darkness faded. What I saw took my breath away. Beneath Blackwater Lake was a city, a massive underwater world glowing with an eerie blue light. Towers made of stone and coral rose up from the lake bed, their surfaces covered in strange markings that seemed to shift and change as I looked at them. Schools of pale fish swam through narrow streets lined with structures that looked like homes, if homes could be built underwater, and then there were them, the crawlers. They moved gracefully through the water, their pale bodies gliding effortlessly between buildings and towers. Up close, they looked even stranger than before, like something caught between human and creature. But they weren't attacking me or trying to scare me away. They were waiting. One of them swam closer, a woman, with long hair floating around her like seaweed. Her face was still human enough to recognize emotion, and what I saw there wasn't anger or malice. It was sadness. She reached out her hand toward me, her fingers long and clawed but gentle as they brushed against mine. And then she spoke, not with words, but with thoughts that echoed in my mind. "You are one of us now." I shook my head, trying to back away, but she held on tightly. "You came here searching for her," she said softly. "She is here." My heart stopped as she turned and pointed toward one of the towers in the distance. I followed her gaze, and that's when I saw her. Emily. She was standing at the base of the tower, her small figure barely visible through the glowing blue light. Her hair floated around her face like she'd been underwater for years, but her eyes, they were still hers. Emily. I tried to call out to her, but no sound came from my mouth, only bubbles rising to the surface above me. She turned slowly toward me, her expression calm but distant, as if she didn't recognize me anymore. My chest tightened as tears filled my eyes. She was alive. But she wasn't Emily anymore. Not completely. The woman beside me spoke again. "She belongs here now." I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My daughter was standing right there, only a few feet away, but it felt like an entire world separated us. She looked so small, so fragile, yet there was something different about her. Her skin was pale, almost glowing in the eerie blue light of the underwater city. Her hair floated around her like she belonged here, like this was her home now, but it wasn't her eyes that broke me. It was the way she looked at me. There was no recognition, no spark of joy or relief. She stared at me like I was a stranger. "Emily," I tried to say again, but my voice didn't work underwater. Only bubbles escaped my mouth, rising up toward the surface far above us. The woman beside me, if I could even call her a woman anymore, watched me with something that almost looked like pity. Her voice echoed in my mind again, calm and steady. "She is not who she was. She has become one of us." I shook my head violently, refusing to believe it. This wasn't right. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. I had come here to find answers, to bring Emily home. But now I was standing in a place that shouldn't exist, surrounded by creatures. That shouldn't be real. I started moving toward Emily, my legs heavy and slow in the water. She didn't move as I approached. She just stood there, watching me with those empty eyes. When I reached out to touch her, she flinched slightly but didn't back away. Her skin was cold, colder than the water around us, and when I held her hand in mine, it didn't feel like holding a child's hand anymore. It felt wrong. Tears blurred my vision as I tried to hold on to her, but she pulled away gently, shaking her head. "She cannot leave," the woman said softly in my mind. "None of us can." I turned back to her, anger bubbling up inside me like fire. Why? I thought as hard as I could, hoping she could hear me the way I heard her. Why can't she leave? Why can't any of you? The woman tilted, her head slightly, her expression unreadable. This is where we belong now, she said simply. The lake chose us. The lake chose them. What did that even mean? None of this made sense. None of it could be real. But here I was, standing in an underwater city with my daughter who wasn't my daughter anymore. I looked back at Emily and saw something flicker in her eyes. Something small but unmistakable. For just a moment, it felt like she recognized me again, like she remembered who I was. And then it was gone. The woman spoke again, her voice softer this time. You have a choice, she said. You can stay here with us, or you can leave. Stay? Leave? What kind of choice was that? How could I leave without Emily? How could I abandon her here in this place? But then the woman's words sank in fully. You can stay here with us. She wasn't just offering me a choice, she was offering me a transformation. If I stayed, if I gave myself to the lake, I would become one of them too. I looked down at my hands again and saw how much they had already changed. My skin was pale and slick now, my fingers longer than they should have been. The process had already started. There might not be any going back for me either. But if I stayed, if I let myself become one of them, maybe I could be with Emily again. Maybe we could be together in this strange new world beneath the water. Or maybe it would destroy what little humanity we both had left. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to think through the fear and confusion swirling in my mind. If I left now, if I fought whatever was happening to me, I might still have a chance at survival. But if I stayed, I opened my eyes and looked at Emily one last time. She reached out toward me hesitantly, her small hand hovering just inches from mine. I stared at Emily's hand, hovering just inches from mine. My heart felt like it was being torn in two. She was right there, close enough to touch, but she wasn't the same little girl I'd lost 3 years ago. She belonged to this place now, to the lake, to the crawlers, and I didn't know where I belonged anymore. The woman's voice came again, soft and steady in my mind. The lake is changing you. Soon, you will be one of us. I shook my head, trying to fight the panic rising in my chest. No. I thought back at her. I don't want this. I just want Emily. She tilted her head slightly, her expression calm but unreadable. If you stay, you will have her, she said. But if you leave, you will lose her forever. I looked at Emily again, tears blurring my vision. She didn't speak. She couldn't, but her eyes said everything. She was waiting for me to decide, waiting to see if I would join her in this strange underwater world or leave her behind. But before I could make my choice, something changed. The water around us began to tremble, rippling violently as if the lake itself was waking up. The humming grew louder, deeper, until it felt like it was shaking the entire city. The crawlers stopped moving, their heads turning toward the surface as if they could sense something coming. And then I saw it. The storm. Above us, through the murky water, flashes of lightning lit up the sky. The rain poured down in sheets, sending waves crashing across the lake's surface. The storm was fierce, angry, and it wasn't just affecting the surface. The water around us churned violently, pulling at the buildings and towers of the underwater city like it was trying to tear them apart. The woman turned back to me, her voice sharp now. "The lake is angry," she said. "It will flood." Flood? What did she mean? Was the storm going to destroy this place? Was it going to spill over into the rivers and streams connected to Blackwater Lake? And then it hit me. The crawlers weren't just trapped here. They were contained. If the lake flooded, if its waters spilled out into other bodies of water, they would escape. They would spread. My chest tightened as I realized what that meant. If Blackwater Lake overflowed, these creatures wouldn't just stay here. They would move into other lakes and rivers, pulling more people into their world beneath the water. I had to stop it. I didn't know how. I didn't even know if it was possible. But I couldn't let this happen. This wasn't just about Emily anymore. It was about everyone else who might fall victim to this nightmare if I didn't do something. I turned back to the woman and thought as hard as I could. How do I stop it? She stared at me for a long moment before answering. You cannot stop the storm, she said, but you can stop us. Her words sent a chill down my spine. Stop them? How? What was she asking me to do? She raised one clawed hand and pointed toward a massive structure at the center of the city. A tower taller than all the others, glowing brighter than anything else around us. Destroy it, she said simply. Destroy it? What would that do? She seemed to sense my confusion and answered before I could ask. It is our source, the heart of our transformation, she said. Without it, we cannot survive. My stomach twisted as her words sank in. She was asking me to destroy their home, to destroy them, all of them. I looked at Emily again, my heart breaking all over again. If I destroyed that tower, if I stopped them, she would be gone too. But if I didn't, more people would suffer. More families would lose their loved ones just like I had lost mine. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to block out everything. The humming, the storm, Emily's empty gaze, and focused on what needed to be done. When I opened my eyes again, I knew what I had to do. The tower wasn't far from where we stood, but every step felt like a battle against myself. My body ached with every movement, the transformation taking hold faster now, but I pushed through it, refusing to let it stop me. The crawlers watched silently as I approached the tower. None of them tried to stop me, not even Emily, but their presence made every moment harder than it already was. When I reached the base of the tower, I saw what powered it. A glowing orb pulsing with blue light like a heartbeat underwater. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. A reminder of everything this place had taken from me and everything it could take from others if I didn't act now. I raised my hand, my clawed hand, and slammed it into the orb with all the strength I had left. The explosion rocked the city instantly, the blue light shattering into fragments that dissolved into the water around us. The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so heavy it felt like gravity itself had shifted. And then everything began to fade. The towers crumbled first, stone and coral collapsing into piles of rubble on the lake bed, followed by the streets and homes that lined them. The crawlers began disappearing too, their pale bodies dissolving into mist that blended with the water until nothing remained. I looked back at Emily one last time before she faded completely, her small figure glowing faintly before vanishing into nothingness. My chest tightened as tears filled my eyes again, but this time they weren't just tears of grief. They were tears of relief, too. She was free now, free from this place, from this nightmare, and so was everyone else who might have been taken by Blackwater Lake in the future. When I woke up hours later on the shore of the Blackwater Lake, everything was quiet again. The mist gone completely and the water calm for once in its existence. I looked down at my hands and saw they were mine again, not clawed or pale or transformed, just human hands trembling slightly as they gripped wet grass beneath me. Blackwater Lake had taken so much from me, but somehow, it had given me back myself, too. My name is Abigail Stonecroft, and I've been a park ranger for almost 15 years. I've seen a lot of strange things during my time in the wilderness. Animals behaving oddly, Sudden storms that vanish as quickly as they come, even trees that seem to hum when no one's around. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened in Shoshone National Forest last summer. It all started with a call from my boss, Chief Ranger Harris. He told me there'd been reports of strange seismic activity near an old petrified forest, deep in the park. Now, Shoshone is famous for its petrified trees, ancient wood turned to stone over millions of years, but this particular area was different. Locals called it the Stone Graveyard. No one went there unless they had to. Something about it just felt wrong. I didn't believe in ghost stories or curses, but even I couldn't deny that the place had a weird energy. The air always felt colder there, even in the middle of summer. Birds avoided it, and animals wouldn't go near it either. People who wandered too close said they felt like they were being watched. Some even claimed to hear whispers coming from the stones. He was skeptical, of course. Whispers? From rocks? It sounded ridiculous. But Harris wanted me to check it out, so I packed my gear and headed out early the next morning. The hike to the stone graveyard wasn't easy. The trail was overgrown, and the deeper I went into the forest, the quieter it got. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just silence. It was eerie, like stepping into another world. When I finally reached the petrified forest, I stopped in, my tracks. The place was massive. Hundreds of stone trees scattered across a barren clearing. Some were upright like frozen sentinels. Others lay broken on the ground, their jagged edges glinting in the sunlight. The air smelled strange too, like wet earth and something metallic. As I walked through the clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow darting between the trees or a flicker of light on the rocks, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, I'd been hiking for hours and hadn't eaten since breakfast, but then something happened that made my blood run cold. I was standing near one of the larger stone trees when I heard it, a faint whispering sound, so soft I almost missed it. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there wasn't any wind. The air was completely still. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing through the clearing. No answer. I took a step closer to the tree and placed my hand on its smooth surface. That's when I felt it. A low vibration humming beneath my fingertips, almost like a heartbeat. I yanked my hand back and stumbled away from the tree, my heart pounding in my chest. What was that? Trees don't have heartbeats. Or whispers. Decided to head back to camp and report what I'd found to Harris. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A small object sticking out of the ground near one of the fallen trees. It looked like a shoe. Curiosity got the better of me, so I walked over and knelt down for a closer look. It was definitely a shoe, an old hiking boot covered in dirt and moss, and next to it was something even stranger. A fossilized footprint embedded in the ground. The footprint didn't belong to any animal I'd ever seen before. It was huge, at least twice the size of my own foot, and shaped like nothing from this world. I took a picture with my phone and marked the spot on my map before heading back to camp as fast as my legs could carry me. Whatever was going on in that petrified forest, it wasn't natural, and deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that fossilized footprint and felt the strange hum of the stone tree under my hand. It wasn't just unsettling, it was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but something about that place felt alive in a way it shouldn't have. Let me tell you a little about myself before I go any further. My name is Abigail Stonecroft, but most people just call me Abby. I've been a park ranger for most of my adult life, and if there's one thing I know, it's that nature is full of mysteries. I've always been drawn to those mysteries, the things people can't explain. That's why I studied geology and ecology before joining the Ranger Service. Rocks, trees, mountains, they all tell a story if you know how to listen. But this? This was different. I've spent years studying petrified wood and fossils. I've seen trees turned to stone by time and pressure, fossils of creatures that lived millions of years ago, but none of them ever felt alive. None of them ever whispered. The next morning, I called Chief Ranger Harris to report what I'd found. He listened quietly as I described the shoe, the footprint, and the strange vibrations in the petrified tree. "Could be seismic activity," he said after a long pause. "There's been some minor tremors in that area recently. Maybe they're causing vibrations in the stone." "Seismic activity doesn't explain the whispers," I said. Harris chuckled nervously. "You've been out there too long, Abby. Get some rest." I wanted to argue, but what could I say? That rocks were talking to me? Even I wasn't sure what I'd experienced. So I hung up and decided to investigate on my own. That afternoon, I went back to the stone graveyard with more equipment: a seismometer to measure ground vibrations, a thermal camera to detect heat signatures, and an audio recorder to capture any sounds. If something strange was going on out there, I wanted proof. The hike felt even longer this time. The silence was heavier, like the forest itself was holding its breath. When I reached the clearing, everything looked exactly as it had before. Silent, still, and unnervingly empty. I set up my equipment near the spot where I'd found the shoe and footprint. The seismometer showed no unusual activity, no tremors or vibrations in the ground, but when I turned on the audio recorder and listened through my headphones, my stomach dropped. There it was again, whispering. It was faint, almost too soft to hear, but it was there, a low murmur that seemed to come from all around me. It wasn't words exactly, more like a mix of sounds that almost formed words but didn't quite make sense. I scanned the clearing with my thermal camera, hoping to catch some kind of heat signature, an animal, or maybe another person, but the screen showed nothing but cold stone and earth. That's when I noticed something strange about one of the fallen trees. Its surface wasn't smooth like the others. It was covered in tiny grooves and ridges that looked almost like writing. Crouched down for a closer look and ran my fingers over the markings. They weren't random scratches or cracks. They were deliberate carvings, etched into the stone with precision. But they weren't in any language I recognized. I took pictures of the carvings with my phone and made a note to research them later. As I stood up, something caught my eye, a glint of light coming from deeper in the forest. It looked like sunlight reflecting off metal, but there shouldn't have been anything metallic out here. Curious, and maybe a little reckless, I decided to follow it. The light led me to a narrow trail winding through the trees. The further I went, the darker it got, until all I could see were shadows and faint outlines of stone trunks around me. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I couldn't turn back now. Finally, the trail opened into another clearing, a smaller one this time, and at its center stood something that made my blood run cold. An old campsite. There was a rusted tent, frame half buried in dirt, a broken lantern lying on its side, and scattered pieces of gear that looked like they'd been there for years. But what really caught my attention was what lay next to the tent, a pile of stones arranged in a perfect circle. Each stone was carved with more of those strange markings, the same ones I'd seen on the tree, and in the center of the circle was another fossilized footprint. Only this one was even larger than the first. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at it. This wasn't just some random geological formation or ancient artifact. Someone, or something, had put these stones here for a reason, and whatever it wasn't human. The discovery of the old campsite stayed with me long after I left the petrified forest that day. I couldn't stop thinking about the carved stones, the fossilized footprint, and the eerie silence that surrounded it all. It felt like I'd stumbled onto something ancient, something that didn't want to be found. I spent the next few days researching everything I could about the area. I combed through old park records, geological surveys, and even local legends, hoping to find some kind of explanation. That's when I came across a report from 5 years ago, a group of spelunkers who had gone missing while exploring a cave system near the petrified forest. The report was brief and vague. It said that 3 experienced cavers had entered a newly discovered cave but never came out. Search teams had combed the area for weeks but found no trace of them, not even their gear. Eventually, the search was called off, and the case was closed as unsolved. I couldn't help but wonder if their disappearance was connected to what I'd seen in the stone graveyard. The cave system wasn't far from where I'd found the old campsite, and both locations had a similar eerie feeling. But what really caught my attention was a note in the report about strange vibrations inside the cave, similar to what I'd felt in the petrified tree. I decided to visit the cave myself. It wasn't an easy decision. I knew it could be dangerous, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was going on here. If those spelunkers had vanished because of whatever was happening in this forest, I needed to find out why. The entrance to the cave was hidden behind a thick wall of vines and moss. It looked like nothing more than a dark hole in the side of a rocky hill, but as soon as I stepped inside, I felt it. The same low hum I'd felt in the petrified tree. It was faint at first, just a gentle vibration under my boots, but as I moved deeper into the cave, it grew stronger. The walls were smooth and cold to the touch, covered in more of those strange carvings, the same ones I'd seen on the stones near the campsite. They seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, as if they were alive. I turned on my flashlight and followed the narrow tunnel deeper into the earth. The air grew colder with every step, and my breath came out in white puffs. The hum grew louder, too, almost like a distant heartbeat echoing through the stone. Suddenly, my flashlight flickered and went out. I froze, my heart racing as darkness swallowed me whole. I fumbled with the flashlight, smacking it against my palm until it flickered back to life. The beam of light cut through the darkness again, but now something was different. The tunnel ahead wasn't empty anymore. There were footprints on the ground, fresh ones, leading deeper into the cave. I stared at them for a moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. They weren't fossilized like the ones in the petrified forest. They were real footprints made by someone, or something, that had been here recently. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I followed them. The tunnel twisted and turned like a maze, growing narrower with each step until I had to crouch down to keep moving forward. The footprints led me to a small chamber at the end of the tunnel, a circular room with smooth stone walls and more glowing carvings. In the center of the chamber was something that made my stomach drop. 3 backpacks lying in a neat row on the ground. They were covered in dust and dirt but still intact, like they'd been placed there deliberately. Next to them was a journal with its cover half rotted away. I picked it up carefully and flipped through its pages. Most of it was unreadable. The ink had smudged over time, but one entry stood out. Day 3. We heard whispers again last night. They're getting louder, closer. The walls feel like they're breathing. I felt my throat tighten as I read those words. Whispers? Breathing walls? It sounded exactly like what I'd experienced in the petrified forest, and now here in this cave. But before I could process what any of it meant, something happened that made my blood run cold. The hum stopped. For a moment, everything was silent, eerily silent. And then, I heard it, a whisper. It started softly at first, a faint murmur coming from somewhere deep within the chamber, but quickly grew louder until it echoed off every surface around me. It wasn't just one voice. It was many voices overlapping each other, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I stumbled backward toward the tunnel, my flashlight shaking in my hand as shadows began to move along the walls. Shadows. That didn't belong to me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran as fast as I could back through the maze-like tunnels, not stopping until I burst out into daylight again. Whatever was down there, It wasn't human, and somehow, I knew it wasn't done with me yet. I didn't go back to the petrified forest or the cave for a few days after that. Honestly, I wasn't sure I ever wanted to. Whatever was happening out there, whatever I'd stumbled into, it wasn't something I could explain away with science or logic. It felt bigger than me, older than me, like I'd accidentally opened a door that was meant to stay closed. But the whispers didn't stop. Even after I left the forest, I kept hearing them. At first, they were faint, just a soft murmur at the edge of my hearing. I thought maybe it was my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me after everything I'd seen. But then they got louder. They followed me everywhere, to my cabin, to the ranger station, even into town when I went to grab supplies. It was like they were inside my head, speaking in a language I couldn't understand but somehow felt familiar. I tried to ignore them, but it was impossible. They weren't just sounds, they were feelings. Every whisper carried a weight, an emotion that pressed down on me like a heavy blanket. Fear, sadness, anger, and something else, something I couldn't quite put into words. It felt like the whispers were trying to tell me something, like they wanted me to understand, but no matter how hard I listened, I couldn't make sense of them. One night, as I sat alone in my cabin, staring at the pictures I'd taken in the petrified forest and the cave, the whispers grew louder than ever before. They weren't coming from inside my head anymore. They were coming from outside, from the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest around my cabin was dark and still, but the whispers were everywhere, echoing through the trees like a chorus of voices calling out to me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I shined my flashlight toward the edge of the forest and froze. One of the petrified trees, the ones from the stone graveyard, was standing there among the living ones. It wasn't supposed to be here. The petrified forest was miles away from my cabin, but somehow this tree had appeared right outside my home. I stepped closer, my flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated the tree's smooth stone surface. The carvings were still there, the strange markings etched into its bark, but now they seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. And then, it spoke. Not with words exactly, but with feelings. Emotions so strong they hit me like a wave. Fear, loss, desperation. It felt like the tree was alive, like it was trying to communicate with me through those carvings and whispers. I placed my hand on its surface, just like I had in the stone graveyard, and immediately felt that same low hum, the heartbeat of something ancient and powerful. Images flashed through my mind, quick and blurry at first but growing clearer with every second. A vast landscape covered in stone trees stretching as far as the eye could see. Shadows moving between them, whispering in a language older than time itself. And deep beneath it all, something sleeping, something waiting to wake up. I pulled my hand back and stumbled away from the tree, gasping for air as those images faded from my mind. Whatever this thing was, whatever these petrified trees were, it wasn't just some natural phenomenon or geological anomaly. It was alive, and it was waking up. The next day, I decided to visit an old friend who lived nearby, a retired geologist named Tom who had spent years studying petrified forests and fossils. If anyone could help me make sense of what was happening, it was him. Tom listened quietly as I told him everything. The whispers, the carvings, the footprints, even the visions from the petrified tree outside my cabin. When I finished talking, he leaned back in his chair and let out a long sigh. "You're not crazy," he said finally. "I've heard stories about places like this before." "What kind of stories?" I asked. "Legends," he said. "Old ones passed down by indigenous tribes who lived in these forests long before we did. They believed some petrified forests weren't just dead trees. They were alive." "Alive? How?" I asked. "They called them stone spirits," Tom said. "Ancient beings that existed long before humans walked this earth. They said these spirits could communicate through whispers and carvings if you knew how to listen. "And what happens if you don't listen?" I asked nervously. Tom's expression darkened. "They wake up." Tom's words stayed with me long after I left his house. "They wake up?" It sounded ridiculous, like something out of a ghost story. But after everything I'd seen, the whispers, the carvings, the petrified tree outside my cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. The petrified forest wasn't just a strange place. It was alive. And whatever was buried beneath it, whatever was waking up, it wasn't going to stop. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. If these stone spirits were real, if they were trying to communicate through whispers and carvings, then I needed to figure out what they wanted before it was too late. The next morning, I packed my gear and headed back to the petrified forest. This time, I didn't just bring my usual equipment. I brought a notebook and a sketch pad to document everything I saw. If the carvings were some kind of language, maybe I could decode them. The hike felt heavier this time. The silence wasn't just eerie, it was oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. When I reached the clearing, I noticed something strange right away. The petrified trees had moved. They weren't in the same places as before. Some had shifted closer to the center of the clearing. Others had tilted at odd angles, their stone trunks casting long shadows across the ground. It felt like they were watching me. I took a deep breath and stepped into the clearing. My boots crunching against the dry earth. The hum was stronger now, louder than it had been before, and as I walked between the trees, I started to feel disconnected. It's hard to explain what happened next. One moment, I was walking through the clearing. The next, everything changed. The air grew colder, and the light around me dimmed until it felt like dusk even though it was midday. The petrified trees seemed taller now, looming over me like silent sentinels, and their carvings glowed brighter than ever. I looked down at my watch and froze. The second hand wasn't moving. Time had stopped. Panic bubbled up in my chest as I turned in circles, trying to make sense of what was happening. The clearing looked different now, bigger somehow, and when I tried to retrace my steps back to the trail, it wasn't there anymore. I was trapped. The whispers started again, soft at first but growing louder with every passing second. They seemed to come from all directions at once, overlapping each other until they formed a single voice. "Come closer." I didn't want to move. I wanted to run, but something about that voice pulled me forward. It wasn't threatening or angry. It was calm and steady, almost familiar. I followed the sound deeper into the clearing until I reached a large petrified tree at its center, the same one where I'd felt that heartbeat during my first visit. But now it looked different. Its surface wasn't smooth anymore. It was covered in carvings that seemed to shift and change as I stared at them. I placed my hand on the tree's surface again and immediately felt that hum, the heartbeat of something ancient and alive. Images flashed through my mind, quick and blurry at first but growing clearer with every second. I saw myself standing in this exact spot, but not just one version of me. There were dozens of me, scattered across different timelines like reflections, in broken glass. Some were older, some were younger, some wore uniforms from decades past while others carried tools I didn't recognize. It wasn't just me trapped here, it was everyone who had ever entered this forest. The whispers grew louder. Again, "Help us." I stumbled back from the tree, gasping for air as those images faded from my mind. Whatever this place was, whatever these stone spirits were, they weren't just waking up. They were pulling people into their world, a world where time didn't exist. And somehow, I knew there was no way out. I don't know how long I stood there staring at that petrified tree. Time didn't feel real anymore. My watch had stopped, and the sun hadn't moved in the sky since I entered the clearing. It was like I was caught in a bubble where nothing changed, except for me. The whispers were still there, circling me like invisible hands tugging at my thoughts. "Help us," they said again, softer this time, almost pleading. I wanted to help, I really did, but I didn't even know where to start. What could I possibly do against something this big, this ancient? I forced myself to move, to look around, the clearing for anything that might give me answers. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A path leading deeper into the forest. It wasn't there when I arrived, I was sure of it, but now it stretched out before me, lined with petrified trees that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. I didn't want to follow it. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back, to run as far away as I could, but deep down I knew I couldn't leave, not yet, not until I understood what was happening here. So, with my flashlight trembling in my hand, I stepped onto the path and started walking. The further I went, the stranger things became. The trees around me seemed to shift and change as I passed, them. Some growing taller, others twisting into impossible shapes. The air grew colder too, and the hum beneath my feet grew louder until it felt like the ground itself was alive. And then I saw them. At first, I thought they were statues, figures made of stone standing motionless among the trees. But as I got closer, I realized they weren't statues at all. They were people, fossilized people. Their faces were frozen in expressions of fear and pain. Their bodies twisted as if they'd been trying to escape something. Some clutched tools or backpacks, others reached out with hands that had turned to stone mid-motion. My stomach churned as I recognized one of them, a man whose face matched a photo from the spelunker's missing persons report. He was holding a climbing rope, his eyes wide with terror as if he'd seen something horrible just before he turned to stone. I stumbled back, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. These weren't just random victims. They were everyone who had ever disappeared in this forest. The spelunkers, the campers from the old site, maybe even people from decades or centuries ago. And somehow, they had all been turned into stone. The whispers grew louder again, surrounding me like a storm. "It's waking." "What's waking?" I shouted into the empty forest, my voice echoing off the petrified trees. "What do you want from me?" For a moment, everything went silent. So silent it felt like even my thoughts had stopped. Then, the ground beneath, my feet began to shake. It wasn't a normal earthquake, it was rhythmic, like footsteps pounding deep below the surface. Each tremor sent a jolt through my body, growing stronger with every second. And then, it rose. The ground split open ahead of me, and something massive began to emerge. A shape so large it blocked out what little light remained in the sky. At first, all I could see was stone, smooth and black like obsidian. But as it rose higher, details began to take shape. Massive arms covered in carvings that glowed faintly in the darkness. A head crowned with jagged spires that looked like horns. Eyes that burned like molten lava. It wasn't just a stone spirit, it was the stone spirit. The one at the heart of this forest. The one that had been sleeping beneath us for centuries. Or maybe longer, and now it was awake. The whispers returned, louder than ever before. "It feeds." I didn't need anyone to explain what that meant. This thing, this ancient being, wasn't just waking up, it was hungry. And all those fossilized people? They weren't just victims. They were its food. I turned and ran as fast as I could, back down the path, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The ground shook violently beneath me as the creature began to move, its massive form tearing through the forest like a living earthquake. Branches snapped and trees fell around me as I sprinted toward what I hoped was safety. But deep down, I knew there was no outrunning something like this. And then, everything stopped. The shaking ceased, the whispers faded away, and when I looked over my shoulder, the creature was gone. For a moment, all I could hear was my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart in my ears. But then, a new sound reached me, a low rumble coming from deep within the earth. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. I didn't know how I made it back to my cabin that night. My legs felt like jelly, my mind was spinning, and my heart wouldn't stop racing. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that massive stone creature rising from the ground, its glowing carvings burning into my memory. I sat on the floor of my cabin, trying to catch my breath when the whispers returned. They were softer now, calmer, like they were trying to soothe me. But they still carried that same urgency, that same plea for help. "What do you want from me?" I whispered back, my voice barely audible. The whispers didn't answer in words. Instead, they filled my mind with images, flashes of scenes that felt like memories but weren't mine. I saw a group of people standing in a circle around a fire, their faces painted with symbols that glowed faintly in the dark. I saw them chanting in unison, their voices blending together like a single heartbeat. And then I saw the stone creature, the same one I'd seen in the forest, sinking back into the earth as if lulled to sleep by their voices. I didn't understand everything I was seeing, but one thing was clear. There was a way to stop it. A ritual, something ancient and powerful that could put the creature back to sleep before it destroyed everything. The whispers grew louder again. "You must!" I shook my head, panic rising in my chest. "I don't know how. I don't even know where. To start!" The whispers didn't respond this time. Instead, they filled my mind with one final image. The petrified tree at the center of the stone graveyard. The one with the glowing carvings and the heartbeat beneath its surface. That was where it had to happen. That was where the ritual needed to be performed. I spent the next few hours gathering everything I thought I might need. Matches, candles, ropes, and anything else that seemed remotely useful. I didn't know exactly what the ritual required, but I figured fire was a safe bet given what I'd seen in those visions. As dawn broke over the horizon, I made my way back to the petrified forest. The hike felt longer than ever before, every step weighed down by fear and uncertainty. But deep down, I knew this was something I had to do. If I didn't, no one else would. When I reached the clearing, everything was exactly as I'd left it. Silent, still, and unnervingly empty. The petrified trees stood like frozen sentinels around me, their carvings glowing faintly in the dim light. I walked to the center of the clearing and placed my hand on the large petrified tree again. The hum was stronger now, louder and faster than before. And as soon as my fingers touched its surface, more images flooded into my mind. This time, they were clearer, more detailed. I saw myself standing in this exact spot, surrounded by glowing carvings and flickering flames. I saw myself chanting words in a language I didn't understand, but somehow knew how to speak. And then, I saw myself disappear. The whispers returned. "You must!" Tears stung my eyes as I pulled my hand away from the tree. "Why me?" I asked aloud, my voice cracking with emotion. "Why does it have to be me?" The whispers didn't answer, not with words anyway. Instead, they filled me with a feeling, a deep sadness mixed with hope and gratitude. It wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who had ever stepped foot in this forest. The spelunkers, the campers, even Tom and Harris and everyone else who lived nearby. This wasn't just my fight. It was theirs too. I spent hours setting up for the ritual, arranging stones in a circle around the tree, lighting candles at each point of the circle, and carving symbols into the dirt using sticks and rocks from around the clearing. Everything felt familiar somehow, like I'd done it all before even though I knew I hadn't. As night fell over the forest, I stood at the center of the circle and took a deep breath. The air was heavy with tension. Even the hum beneath my feet seemed to pause for a moment as if waiting for me to begin. I closed my eyes and let the whispers guide me. The words came naturally. Soft at first, but growing louder with every syllable until They echoed through the clearing like a song. Kashal Mora, Etrai Veshan, Kashal Mora, Etrai Veshan. The carvings on the petrified trees began to glow brighter as if responding to my voice. The hum beneath my feet grew stronger. Too, faster now, but instead of feeling threatening or chaotic, it felt calm, like a heartbeat slowing down. But just as I thought it might be working, something changed. The ground began to shake violently beneath me, not like before when it felt rhythmic or controlled, but wild and chaotic like an earthquake tearing through the forest. And then it appeared again. The stone creature rose from the ground once more, larger than ever before, with its glowing eyes fixed directly on me. Its massive arms reached out toward me as if trying to grab hold of something unseen. For a moment, fear paralyzed me, but then something inside me shifted. This wasn't just about fear or survival anymore. It was about trust, trusting myself, trusting those whispers that had guided me here every step of this journey. So instead of running or screaming or giving up, I kept chanting Kashal Mora, Etrai Veshan, Kashal Mora, Etrai Veshan. And slowly, but surely, it began to work. The creature's movements grew slower, its glowing eyes dimmed, its massive form began sinking back into the earth just like in those visions from before. By the time my voice faded into silence, it was gone. For a moment, everything was still. The stone creature was gone, its massive form swallowed back into the earth. The glowing carvings on the petrified trees dimmed until they faded completely, leaving only cold, lifeless stone behind. Even the hum beneath my feet had disappeared, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed down on me like a heavy weight. I should have felt relieved. I should have been happy that it was over. But instead, I felt empty. The whispers were still there, soft now, almost like a gentle breeze brushing against my thoughts, but they carried a new message this time, one that made my stomach drop. It is not finished. I shook my head, tears welling up in my eyes. What do you mean? I did everything you asked. The ritual worked. It's gone. The whispers didn't answer with words. Instead, they filled me with a feeling, a deep, unshakable truth that settled in my chest like a stone. The creature wasn't gone. Not completely. It was asleep again, yes, but only for now. The ritual had bought us time, but it wasn't a permanent solution. Eventually, it would wake up again. And when it did, someone would have to perform the ritual all over again to put it back to sleep. Unless the whispers grew louder, more insistent. A guardian. I froze as their meaning became clear. The ritual wasn't just about putting the creature to sleep. It was about binding someone to it. Someone who could stay here, connected to the forest and its ancient power, to make sure the creature never woke up again. Someone like me. No, I whispered, shaking my head as panic clawed at my chest. No, there has to be another way. You can't ask me to do this. But deep down, I knew they weren't asking. They were telling me what had to be done. I thought about all the people who had disappeared in this forest. The spelunkers, the campers, everyone who had been turned into stone by this ancient force. I thought about Tom and Harris and everyone else who lived nearby, completely unaware of the danger lurking beneath their feet. If I didn't do this, they'd all be at risk. The whispers softened again, filling me with a strange sense of calm. This wasn't just about sacrifice, it was about purpose, about becoming part of something bigger than myself. I took a deep breath and stepped back toward the petrified tree at the center of the clearing. Its surface was cold and smooth under my hand as I closed my eyes and let the whispers guide me one last time. The words of the ritual came naturally now, flowing from my lips like they'd always been there. Kashal Mora, Etrai Veshan. Kashal Mora, Etrai Veshan. As I chanted, I felt a warmth spreading through my body. A soft glow that started in my chest and radiated outward until it surrounded me completely. The carvings on the tree began to glow again, brighter than ever before, and for a brief moment, I felt weightless, and then everything went dark. When I opened my eyes again, everything was different. I wasn't standing in the clearing anymore. Not exactly. I could still see it around me, the petrified trees, the circle of stones, but it all felt distant somehow, like I was looking at it through a foggy window. I tried to move, but realized I couldn't, not in the way I used to. My body felt heavy and solid, like stone fused with earth itself, and then it hit me. I was stone now. I wasn't Abigail Stonecroft anymore, not in the way people had known me. I was part of the forest now, a guardian bound to its ancient power, watching over the creature below to make sure it never woke up again. The whispers were gone now, replaced by a deep silence that felt strangely comforting. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, I felt at peace. Years passed after that, or maybe decades. Time didn't feel real anymore in this form, but every now and then I'd catch glimpses of people wandering into the forest. Hikers taking pictures of the petrified trees, researchers studying fossils, even kids playing hide-and-seek among the stones. They didn't know what lay beneath their feet or how close they were to waking something ancient and dangerous. But that was okay. They didn't need to know. That's why I was here, to protect them from what they couldn't see or understand. Sometimes I wondered if anyone remembered me, if Tom or Harris ever thought about what happened to Abigail Stonecroft after she disappeared into the forest one final time. But those thoughts didn't bother me anymore. Not really, because as long as they were safe, that was enough.